At the hero's birth, everything was engulfed in flames and ashes spread across the small village. A village that existed in a world where countless heroes are born. After finally escaping the forests of darkness, our boy, Choi Han, is welcomed by an old man who extends a hand to him. Alongside a few others who were there, he formed bonds of friendship and family in the village of Harris. Until long after, upon returning from a harvest, the young man finds a deplorable scene. All the citizens had been annihilated by a secret organization. Until then, Choi Han had a gentle soul, incapable of killing anyone. But his eyes filled with hatred and a thirst for vengeance when he saw what had been done to those who helped him. That was the first time he killed someone. Wielding a blade against the enemy, he demands they reveal their identity. However, our boy doesn't answer. He charges straight at the thugs. The gang leader orders everyone to use the young man as a dartboard, and the group prepares to attack. But he's faster and swiftly removes every obstacle in his path for good. Amidst the disaster, the protagonist weeps for his loss, only regaining his sanity after ensuring they wouldn't return. Drawing his sword, which reflected the burning houses, the young man falls into despair upon realizing he got no information about the organization. He falls to his knees, swearing to himself he would annihilate every remaining member for doing that to his loved ones. After that, Choi Han left the village for the first time, heading toward the capital of the Hennetus territory in the west, where he found his next target, a redhead named Kale, who was quickly taken down by the hero. When the redhead opens his eyes and sees himself in the mirror, the memories come rushing back. He was sure he had fallen asleep while reading the book The Birth of a Hero, which he had borrowed over the weekend. Looking at his new identity in the mirror, he wonders if this was some sort of possession. Before bathing, the young man questioned whether he really was Kale from that moment on. After all, the redhead was a weakling. However, relaxing in the hot bathwater, he thinks it's not like he left anything behind. He had been an orphan with no money, no friends, and no family, back when he still went by the name Kim Rok-soo. What motivated him was the sheer hatred of ending up underground. He hated pain. He was convinced that a painful life was still better than not living at all. Running his hands over his body, he takes note of the fact that he didn't have a single scratch, meaning he hadn't met Choi Han yet. The young man remembers that in Kale's first meeting with the hero, he got completely drunk, caused a scene, and ended up with a scar. And all because he didn't like the drink. He really was an idiot. Lost in thought, Kim couldn't remember what happened to Kale after that. But he knew Choi Han had fateful encounters, overcame many hardships, and became a true hero. Kim Rok-soo's objective, now that he had become Kale, was simple: don't get his ass beat. Getting out of the bath, he thinks everything would unfold according to plan as long as that was the only thing that changed. That way he'd live a long, quiet, meaningless, relaxing, and comfortable life. Shouldn't be that hard. Someone outside the room calls him young master and asks if he's still bathing, which catches his attention. Wearing a bathrobe, he replies that he's coming out. Then a gray-haired man smiles while bringing him some water. It was Ron, a former executioner who had escaped by ship to the west and became a butler. Even with his gentle facade, our boy knew the old man was dangerous. The redhead grabs the cup, thanking him while already thinking about how to pawn him off on Choi Han as soon as possible. Seeing the young man take the drink, the man gives a sly smile. He was surrounded by dangerous and powerful people now, so the protagonist needed to grow stronger to take care of himself. That way he could live the peaceful life he dreamed of even during an imminent war, but he couldn't become too strong to the point of drawing attention. Another one of his employees enters the room saying he was there to help him get dressed, and the MC asks for something simple. Looking at himself in the mirror, he admires how any outfit looks good on him. After all, he was a good-looking guy. He considered appearance extremely important. The redhead calls his subordinate, who promptly follows him down the hallway while the maids greet him. One of them in particular trembles and stutters as she says good morning, and Kim senses something is off. It was strange because as far as he knew, Kale never hit anyone, though he did throw stuff at others when drunk. Either way, it was better for him if they didn't bother him. Ron opens the door for the boy, wishing him a good breakfast, and he responds with a thank you. Upon entering the room, Kim's surprise is obvious. Kale Hennetus's family was waiting for him at the table. His father, Deruth Hennetus, was the current head of the lineage, married to his stepmother, Madame Violin. Besides them, there was also his younger brother, Basin, and the youngest, Lily. The patriarch comments on the MC's tardiness and tells him to sit, which he does. He wasn't anything special, just had a bit of money. He didn't have much to say about his stepmother or siblings either, which made that the perfect environment to live in. That is, if you ignored all the disapproving looks from every one of them. They seemed uncomfortable with his presence, so Kim rushed to eat and leave. Basin drops his utensil on the floor, shocked that his brother smiled. Apparently, it wasn't a common occurrence. The boy apologizes, which confuses the protagonist. One of the maids serves wine, which the boy smells but doesn't drink. When he comments that the food is delicious, his father jumps to agree, saying it was awful, until he realizes what his son actually said. It was news to them that the redhead liked anything, apparently, and the man is stunned when he reaffirms that he enjoyed it. Then Deruth tells him to enjoy and eat a lot, to which the boy responds, "Yes, father, you too." Just as he thought, being trash was great. No one yelled at him for being rude. Besides, he couldn't let Basin get mad at him. This way, he could live lazily as the older brother of the lord who ruled the territory. Otherwise, he'd have to find another place to stay until the war ended. The redhead wipes his mouth when his father asks if he needs anything. He reflects for a moment before asking if he could have some money. Daruth nods, saying he'd give him plenty, and the young man thanks him, saying the more the better, which makes the man reiterate that he'd give as much as possible. Once again, he smiles, but his expression quickly turns to shock upon seeing how much money he received. That family wasn't just rich, they were filthy rich. Since that was the case, he decides to adjust his plans, calling for the butler to ask what day it was. And the old man replies that it's the 29th day of the 3rd month in the year 781 of the Felician calendar, which meant he didn't have much time, because Choi Han would arrive there very soon. Arriving at the center of the city, the redhead stops in front of a library, while his subordinate stares tensely at his back until he says he can go now, shocking the young man. He double-checks that he really doesn't need to stay, and the boy says he won't be there long. Entering the place, his presence seems to intimidate everyone around, except for the owner, who greets him with a big smile. His name was Billos, a ridiculously rich son of a mistress. It was funny, because he looked a lot like a piggy bank. No beating around the bush, the MC throws a handful of coins on the table and explains that he'll be using the 3rd floor all day, asking for any tea that's not bitter. He asks if they have any novels besides poems, and the short man tells him not to worry. Then the redhead requests the most interesting book available and a cup of tea, making the owner nod. Saying he'll be drinking more tea later, he hands another coin to Billos, shocking the small man, who says $1 million was way too much for tea. But he says he has a lot of money, so he could think of it as a tip. Sitting alone on the 3rd floor, Kim was sure this was the perfect spot. He remembers that Choi Han is still being stopped at the city gates while trying to report what happened earlier that morning. The hero prioritized honoring the souls of his loved ones over gathering information about those responsible for the attack. He really seemed like a kind person. Kale's memories flood his mind. The rich brat used to shout that his father didn't care about commoners, and that the drink in his hand was worth more than the lives of everyone in the village, which Choi Han found quite interesting. Smiling, he said he was very curious to see whether he'd change his mind or not. Then he charged at the filthy bourgeois, eager to find out. Back in reality, Kim breaks into a cold sweat just thinking about what was going to happen next. He needed to stop thinking about that damn novel. But there was Choi Han, standing in front of the guards who were asking for his identification, as if he'd have something like that. So they tell them to go away, but the protagonist knew he would wait for nightfall to climb the city walls. That's when he finds Kale drunk. At that point in the story, the redhead gets up from the table and asks Billos not to let anyone take his spot because he'd be back. As he leaves the place, everyone stares at the door in shock. He hadn't broken anything, which apparently was typical of Kale, who hears it all from outside. Changing the subject, Kim directs his thoughts to the fact that he needs power to protect himself and face powerful enemies, just enough to live a long, peaceful life before the continent goes to war. But not too strong, being discovered would be terrible. Kim reflects on the ancient powers that exist in that dimension, especially the amorphous shield. He was set. He needed to get it today. When he enters a bakery, the owner is startled by his presence, desperately welcoming him. At this point, he wasn't even surprised anymore by the exaggerated reactions. So he just tells him to bring him some bread, which confuses the man. But the boy points to one end of the counter, explaining that he wanted all the bread from that end to the other, and throws a 1 million coin, ordering the purchase to be wrapped. Noticing the silence, he says he could always buy elsewhere in case the man didn't want to sell him anything. That puts the shopkeeper on high alert, and he quickly denies it, saying he'd get everything ready right away. In the end, the redhead walks out with a massive sack of bread slung over his back. As he walks, he realizes how different that world was from Korea. It really was a fantasy world. The way people looked at him bothered him. Apparently, Kale acted like trash everywhere he went. He needed to leave as soon as possible. 2 kids watch him from hiding as he hikes up a hill toward a large tree surrounded by stones. When he finally reaches the top, he's exhausted but glad it's done. His small fortress had a wooden gate that looked very old, and observing the tree, he figured it had to be a few hundred years old. But then a child yells at him not to get close to the plant. It was the same 2 who were spying on him earlier, telling him that it was a man-eating tree. Legend says that everyone who ends up wrapped in it becomes a mummy by nightfall. Smiling, Kim realizes he's in the right place. A long time ago, a priestess had been banished from her clan due to her gluttony and love of food, and that's when a passage formed, from which a tree was later born. That place held all the power and resentment of the priestess, and also the power of the shield the boy was after. Scattering the bread on the ground, the boy tried to find the exact location, while the kids shouted for him to leave. Their voices annoyed him, so he had to get rid of the brats before continuing with his plan. He stands up, scaring the 2 little ones who kept repeating the same warnings. Already tired, the redhead says nothing was going to happen to him and tosses 2 wrapped loaves their way, telling them to grab the food and leave. Even after taking the bread, they kept warning him that the tree was too dangerous. So the protagonist stares at them seriously, asking if they didn't know Kale, the piece of trash. That scares the 2 of them, finally leaving him alone. But one of them says she hopes he doesn't sleep forever after this. Ignoring the little chatterbox, Kim begins burying the bread around the tree. As soon as he places the first loaf, the food vanishes instantly, and he thinks that if he's not careful, the soil might eat his hand too. Apparently, the shield still held the priestess's resentment, and it died starving. It was kind of funny that this turned into an ancient power. Still, it was pretty fitting. Staring into the hole, the boy remembers he had to feed it until the darkness born from the priestess's resentment disappeared. As soon as it vanished, a light would appear in its place, and then the shield would be all his. The boy decides to dump the entire sack of bread into the hole at once, telling the lady to eat as much as she wants. However, after that, the hole remained untouched. Apparently, he'd have to sacrifice 10 more full sacks. A terrifying noise comes from the ground, making the protagonist wonder what she was trying to say. Either way, he says goodbye to the tree, promising he'd return the next day. The children were sitting behind the wall surrounding the tree, devouring the bread with endless hunger. Their presence made Kim uneasy, though he figured they wouldn't get close to the tree because of how scared they were. Better safe than sorry. They stare at him, confused, and he says, "If you want more bread tomorrow, don't say a word," heading back to the city. At the end of the day, the boy says goodbye to Billows, complimenting the tea, and mentions that even though he only read half the book, he really enjoyed it, especially the protagonist, his skills, and development. He asks that no one else reads it so he can grab it again when he returns. The blonde man nods, promising he'll reserve the book just for him, and tells him to come back anytime. But the redhead doesn't get why he's so enthusiastic. A bit later, the MC walks into a bar, shocking a dark-haired guy who seemed to be one of the employees. He greets him nervously, so exaggeratedly that even Kim notices he's scared. Thinking about it, it made sense. Everything around Kale got destroyed whenever he started drinking. The young man tosses a coin to the worker, asking him to bring a bottle of whatever he usually drinks and a roasted chicken breast with no salt. The guy asks if he wanted help getting to a table, but his silence is enough to make it clear that wasn't the case. Nervous, the server rushes off to get his order. Even the crooks and scammers in the bar were tense, which felt very strange to Kim. Normally, the trash of a rich family should hang around this kind of crowd, but Kale despised them. He saw them as nothing but the scum of society. He says thanks when his order arrives, and examining the drink, assumes it's the most expensive one in the place. Walking through the city streets, the redhead drinks straight from the bottle, feeling the burn from the first sip. Even so, he tries to stay focused on walking 100 steps toward the outer walls. When he gets there, it's just like he expected. That's where Choi Han would climb the wall, where a small kitten would be pushed off by another, falling to the ground. That kind of coincidence was common in this world. Who would guess that Choi Han would twist his ankle trying not to land on the cat when he jumped? Seeing the boy lying on the ground, he thinks he must be a really good person. He had finally found him. The MC trembles. He knows he needs to take the initiative and make a good first impression. So he talks to the cats, placing the chicken breast in front of them and encouraging them to eat. They were smaller than he expected and approached him cautiously. Not knowing if they could eat a whole chicken breast, Kim starts tearing it apart to make it easier. One of them starts mewing loudly, so the redhead pets it, asking them to eat so they can get better quickly, until someone asks if he had somewhere to go. It was Choi, who was still sitting in the same spot. Without answering, the boy asks if he was hungry too. Since the hero doesn't answer either, the protagonist figures he's probably still cautious. So he insists on the question, and finally the dark-haired boy nods. Kim walks over to him, telling him to follow because he'd give him food. After all, the best way to make a good impression was by being the guy who fed him well. As the outsider follows, he celebrates silently in his mind. But one of the cats stops him, rubbing against his shoe. He didn't really like cats much, but those ones were super cute. He couldn't just ignore them anymore. The boy kneels down to pet one of them, asking if it liked him that much and apologizing for having to leave. He says goodbye, making both kittens walk away, which lets him resume his walk. Near his house, he thinks the little creatures were probably pretending not to talk, but Choi Han would definitely be able to understand everything. Kim asks if the boy was okay, worried that he may have changed his mind about him being easy to kill, and wonders if he wasn't going to show up anymore. One of his guards calls out to him, stuttering, "I am master." That was so annoying, and even worse when they stuttered. The dude finally enters, being greeted by Ron, which startles the protagonist since the old man really had waited for him this whole time. He stares at Choi as if sparks were flying everywhere, until Kim steps in. The butler asks if something's wrong and says he could escort the other man if needed, but he declines. That meeting between the two should be enough for now. At the top of the stairs, the blonde guy who helped him dress greets him, and asks, worried, if he had come back after drinking. His name was Hans, and he was the vice butler, which basically meant he was like a babysitter for the redhead. He extends the empty bottle to the servant, who instinctively goes into a defensive stance, afraid he's about to get hit. But the boy just asks him to throw the bottle away, which makes the guy smile in relief. As he's leaving, Kim says he'll throw it at him next time, scaring the poor guy, who then asks where he's headed. The two of them go to the second kitchen because Choi Han needed to meet one more person that night. B. Crocs, the son of the annihilator, or butler, Ron, who was busy sharpening kitchen tools. He was no innocent man. The cook was another dangerous guy, cooking with those huge hands and a terrifying face. And Choi Han needed to meet him because after seeing his skills slicing kale, B-Crocs would become interested in him and start following him. So if he left him with the outsider, his father would likely follow him too. Two birds with one stone. The redhead asks him to make something for the boy to eat, but the cook asks him to repeat that with a knife in hand, which makes the MC tell him to put it down. He explains that the guest was hungry, so he should cook something. B-Crocs sighs but simply nods and obeys. Finally, Ron, Choi-Han, and B-Crocs were all connected. This makes Kim smile. Taking advantage of the moment, the young man asks him to prepare something for himself too, adding that he only wanted the best, like the meat from last night. The cook looks tired and a bit sad and gets slightly confused when the MC praises him, saying he was a great chef, saying that something like that dish would be perfect and asking him to cook it quickly. Hans shows up to speak with the young master and asks what he should do about the guest, to which the redhead says that he's his guest, so he should take good care of him. Now that he connected the three, his job was done for the day. If that didn't work, he'd have to let Choi-Han get hurt a little for B-Crocs to see. Tired, he tells the blonde to bring his food to his room once it's ready. Quickly, the vice butler informs Kale's father about the situation with the unidentified young man. And Daruth seems intrigued to learn that his son came home sober, wondering if he should assign someone to keep an eye on him, but soon gives up on the idea. As long as he was in his territory, he'd have to handle everything Kale did, so he simply asks Hans to keep watching him at home and report later. The blonde bows, confirming he would do so. Daruth thought his son had changed, apparently. It wasn't like he had become stronger or smarter, but his actions were definitely different. Breaking the silence, he orders the servant to bring him information on the bastard son of the Flynn Merchant Guild, Billows. The man nods and leaves the room. Pensive, the patriarch concludes that it wasn't just Kale who was changing. The atmosphere of the continent was getting dangerous. His family had been protecting their wealth and growing steadily. He remembered when he told his children to live for their own happiness, without worries. The Lord then decides he'll reinforce the territory's walls. In the morning in Kim's room, the redhead wasn't feeling well, and Ron's lemonade was only making it worse. The old man explains that since his master was sleeping peacefully, he decided not to wake him. He asks if he hurt his neck since he was wearing a bandage there, and the butler asks if he's worried about him or something, which the boy denies, explaining that it was just annoying to look at. But Ron says it's nothing serious, claiming he got scratched by a cat, while thinking about the incident with Choi-Han and B-Crocs. Kim drinks the lemonade in silence. He knew that the cat in question was a very specific and innocent person. Once he finishes, he gets up and the gray-haired man asks if he's heading out, which the boy confirms he had a few things to take care of. But before he can leave, Ron asks what he thought of the lemonade, and he says it was delicious, not understanding the point of the question. Anyway, the young man opens the door to leave, only to come face to face with Choi, standing like a statue in front of his room. It startles the protagonist, who slams the door shut from the surprise. But the butler smiles, explaining that his guest from the previous day was waiting outside, adding that he was about to tell him, but he opened the door first. He even told Choi-Han to wait in the room he used, but he refused. He was definitely about to say something, had the chance to say it, but chose not to. Opening the door again, the redhead asks what happened for the hero to be standing there. The only word that comes out of his mouth is repay, leaving the host confused. Then Choi-Han explains that he came to repay him for the food, but he refuses, asking if he needed him for anything else. Seriously, who would take advantage of that kid? That makes the boy admit that yes, he did want help, but Kim knew it would be something about the village, and that was something he absolutely could not get involved with. To get rid of him, he tells him to direct the request to Hans, since he could help with pretty much anything. And pulling Ron by the shoulders, he says the old man was also skilled and could help with whatever was needed. The guest doesn't really know what to say and argues that the redhead didn't even know him. But that didn't matter to the MC, who asks if he really needed a reason to help the less fortunate, saying that judging by his situation, it didn't look like he'd asked for anything too difficult. And if it was, Hans would know where to draw the line. Then he says goodbye. He needed to get money, since he was going to spend a lot. Before he can get far, Ron states he'll follow the young master's orders. Kim stares at him for a moment before continuing on his way. It didn't matter whether he went or not. Overcoming hardships was for the protagonist and his party. Watching Kale walk away, the old man thought it was interesting that he didn't like sour things and yet drank the whole cup of lemonade. Apparently, the brave little cub was scared, like he knew something. Choi-Han pulls him out of his thoughts by asking to be shown the way. And despite the strong smell of red paint on his clothes, he kept pretending to be innocent. He was actually quite clever. Ron tells him to follow, which the hero does, though staying very alert. Back at the protected tree, the redhead fed it all the bread he could find. Even so, the ground kept demanding more, which was driving the boy insane. The voice of the woman mentioned in the book belonged to a priestess who had died alongside the god of hunger. However, today he had to return before dinner, since Daruth had requested his presence in the office at night. He was planning to satisfy half of the tree's hunger today, so he needed to hurry. Returning to the city, he notices the children from the previous day eating more bread by the tree's fence, but he ignores them. Since he had bought out the entire bakery stock the day before, it would take some time to prepare enough again to fill the tree. In that case, he needed to find another bakery. His plans are interrupted by someone who catches his attention. It was a cheerful young woman saying they had plenty of bread in her bakery, a lucky coincidence. That was a real businesswoman, and Kim tosses her a coin, telling her to bring all the stock quickly. Her eyes sparkle as she stares at the 1 million coin in her hand, and she rushes into the store, asking him to wait just a moment. The woman soon hands him a massive bag with the order and assures him she can prepare a new batch. He was starting to like that woman more and more, but then a man yells that his team could bake even more bread than her. So the MC gives a coin to the guy, asking him to prepare a bag since he'd come by next time. Tomorrow he'd have 3 stores to visit. Nearby, hidden in an alley, B. Crocs wondered what the hell he was plotting, like he'd gone insane. He didn't care at first when his father said he was an interesting boy, but the more he watched, the more he began to agree. On the other hand, watching him might be just as entertaining as watching the dark-haired brat. After climbing the hill with all that bread, Kim gives the kids a jar with a plant inside. One of them says that's not bread, but the boy just shrugs, telling them to move. Still, they stand their ground, saying he couldn't just go and die like that. Back when he was Kim Rock-soo, he knew people were nice to him because he was a penniless orphan. And until he got older, he never understood the words, "Do you need a reason to help the unfortunate?" Dan, he hated seeing kids in misery, but that didn't mean he was going to take care of the 2 of them. So he assures them that nothing bad would happen to him. Moving forward, the boy dumps all the bread into the hole again, and he celebrates because finally the darkness seemed to be clearing. But to his surprise, when he comes out, the 2 kids are nowhere to be seen. On one hand, he feels better not seeing hurt children, until he notices that the 2 cats from the previous day are on the mountain. Even if they weren't kids anymore, he hoped they didn't remember him. He didn't want to get involved in any trouble. Back at home, he finally figured out what his father wanted. Basically, Kale would have to go to the capital as the representative of House Henatus. The news makes him sulk. Dareth explains that Basin would have gone, but the eldest was the MC, and the royal family was organizing an event where the heirs of noble families were invited. Even though he participated in these kinds of events for the last 2 years, Basin still hadn't attended a royal gathering, but this time he wanted the redhead to go. The mention of royal events reminds our boy of the terrorist incident in the plaza, which hadn't happened yet. Some secret organization would carry out the attack while the citizens were gathered, and the one responsible for stopping half of their plans would be Choi Han. He would save countless lives, getting closer to the royal family by becoming friends with the crown prince. The thought gives him chills again. He'd have to be part of that incident. Basin had a sour expression, and Kim thinks he could suggest that Basin go in his place, since he definitely didn't want to go somewhere dangerous. But he also couldn't just tell his brother to go. He didn't know Daruth's intentions in sending the family's trash to the capital. His father says he'd be leaving in 5 days, but in 5 days, the original Kale would have already been beaten up by Choi Han. He couldn't go. His father argues that he was used to going there before Basin was even born, and it was a good chance for a relaxing trip. Even so, Kim explains that he's confused by the sudden change, asking to think about it for a bit. And the old man gives in, telling them both to leave. Outside the office, Basin tells Kale there's no reason for him not to go to the event, which is a terrible sign. He's about to be pushed into the hair position. Basin had held that position for years, but now he was saying there was no reason to refuse being the family's representative. Things were getting way too complicated. And it was a great opportunity for Daruth, since Kale would probably come back unharmed from the trip. Besides, if anything happened to his brother, the responsibility would fall on the redhead. He had to survive. Hans calls the MC to talk about Choi, but he cuts him off, telling him to bring the guy over. From the servant's expression, the guest's situation had been handled properly, but now there was this damn trip. So he warns that if Choi Han refuses to come, Hans should say the word repay. He'd do whatever it took to make that trip comfortable, and he would use Choi Han to make it happen. Watching the boy, the MC notices he's doing much better now that Ron is handling all his meals. Clearly, he and B. Crocs were getting along just fine. Getting straight to the point, the hero asks how he could repay our boy. Some changes were already showing up in the birth of a hero, even though Kim was trying hard not to go too far, which definitely wouldn't be possible if he really went to the capital. Handing Choi a piece of paper, he explains that before revealing anything, he had to know whether or not he was capable of helping him. To put it simply, this was a job interview. The boy tells him to go ahead, and Kim asks if he really knew how to protect someone. This leaves him confused, thinking the redhead realizes this sudden change of plans could actually benefit him more than before, because he might be able to stop Choi Han's group from obtaining the ancient powers, so he says it was a simple question. Did he know how to protect people? Or could he only destroy them? The question hits him like a stake to the chest, and the hero says he's not sure. The redhead insists, wanting to know if he could destroy people despite that. When the boy confirms, he suggests that in that case, he could protect them too. It was hard, but not impossible. In the life Rock-soo had lived, he couldn't avoid things just because they were difficult. That's why he accepted life in Kale's body, but everything felt hard here. The hero smiles, saying the protagonist was right. The last question of the interview was even simpler. He wanted to know the name of the new hire, even though he already knew it. Choi Han is shocked that he doesn't know his name, and the boy replies, saying his name was the guy who was going to beat me up. He did know his name from other people, but he wanted to hear it from him directly. Friendly, the black-haired young man extends his hand to Kim, introducing himself as Choi Han. The two shake hands as if sealing the deal. And the redhead also introduces himself as Kale Henatus. Back to business, the job he needed done was pretty simple, and the hero quickly starts writing down the names Kim mentions. One was the princess from the neighboring kingdom who survived an annihilation attempt, Rosalind. The other, the heir to the Wolf King, Locke. The sole survivor of the wolf tribe, Locke looks weak and ordinary at first glance. But when he goes into berserk mode, he becomes a violent and brutal werewolf. Rosalind, on the other hand, has the greatest destructive power after Choi Han. But she wasn't interested in the throne. Her dream was to found the biggest magic tower on the continent. And in the future, the one who tried to kill the princess would be tortured by Beecrocs. Back to the interview, Kim feels a chill run through his body, something that's been happening more and more frequently. He celebrates the fact that Choi Han read before grabbing the continent map so they could discuss it. The guy explains that he just needed to follow the instructions he marked on the map and would accompany him up to a specific point. The reason for that is because in the early chapters of The Birth of a Hero, a certain Marcus is introduced as a villain after Kale appears. He's the villain responsible for messing up the Crown Prince's and Choi Han's plans. The lunatic even created a crazy dragon. The blonde guy tried to tame a baby dragon less than 5 years old, but when it managed to escape, he went nuts and ran into the city of Berserk. In the story, Choi Han ends up killing that dragon and gifts it the freedom called the End of Life. Kate had to go to the village where that beast would attack, so they wouldn't arrive late at the capital. It was one of two options. Either Choi Han would finish it off, or he'd free it before that chaos. The mission was simple. He had to go to the capital with those two individuals to reward the redhead. The hero asks if all he had to do was protect them, to which the boy replies that if he wants to, yes. However, what he had to do no matter what was to meet him in the capital without any injuries, and he assures that at least he could protect himself. The boy's silence bothers the MC, who insists on the question until Choi Han confirms that he could handle it. All that chatter makes Kim regret not drinking before the interview. Finally, he tells the hero to leave, but warns him that everything they had discussed there should stay between the two of them, and the young man states that that was crystal clear. During the night, the protagonist goes to Daruth to ask for more money, which wasn't a problem. The man says he'll inform the treasurer and hands him a check. In his room, the redhead admires the paper in his hand, reflecting on how money really was the best thing in the world. When Ron walks into the room, he offers him lemon tea with honey, explaining that his son made it just for him, and wishes him a great night, reaffirming that he'd always be by the young master's side. However, the visit leaves him sulky because the old man had managed to ruin his sleep. He needed to find a way to leave those two with Choi Han no matter what. The next day, Kim was walking around cold sweating, remembering the horror movie he witnessed when he woke up. Ron asked if it was his first time going to the capital and offered to hunt bunnies for him, saying he was really good at it. The old man said they had to be very careful when hunting small animals because you couldn't tell if they escaped, and they should gut them as soon as they were caught. Seriously, what a creepy guy. Even so, he was happy that Ron and Beecrocs were going with him to the capital. The baker greets him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He had gotten used to the redhead after so many deliveries, but he ignores all of the baker's excitement and asks if everything was ready. As he hands over the bag of bread to the young man, the worker asks if that was really the last day, to which Kim replies by asking if he's being greedy. And the man says yes, which makes the boy give a sly smile. He pats the mustached man on the shoulder, saying he'd come back whenever he wanted bread again, leaving him standing there. Continuing his walk, the MC sighs as he notices the same kids is always sitting nearby. Did they not have anywhere to go? As usual, he hands them 2 bags of bread, but quickly goes on his way. Reaching the top of the mountain, the guy celebrates the fog covering the city, since that way he could get what he wanted without any worries. Then he starts the same process as every day, tossing the bread down into that deep hole, which always asked for more. She ate way too much. Until a ray of light shines on the ground. Though it wasn't much, the darkness was clearing up, which made Kim feel rewarded for his efforts. However, even after finishing her meal, the priestess kept begging for more, scaring the redhead. That wasn't something he had read in the novel. She promises to give him a gift if he brings more bread, and so he does. Emptying the last bag, he hoped that the darkness would vanish. The ground did light up after all, surprising the boy. Then the girl exclaims that the food was delicious. The soft texture made her pick the 3rd bag as her favorite. She thought the food was getting better over the years. She could even taste the wheat from the latest batch, but all that chatter just made Kim understand why no one wanted to satisfy the girl's hunger. Apparently, her grudge was not being unable to eat, but being unable to speak. She keeps rambling on, talking about how food in ancient times was bad. The people from the forest only fed her terrible things. As time passed, she had been banned from there and ended up with a reputation for being a glutton. Even without any patience, Kim knew he had to listen if he wanted the powers. Because counting the seconds until it was over, he couldn't take hearing about food anymore. Still, he just agreed with everything the woman said, and she thanked him, calling him a good boy. That plan of just agreeing wasn't working, because the lady seemed to have a lot more to say. As time passed, he noticed that the tree was getting brighter, which was interesting. The boy brought his hand close to that intense light, feeling the warmth that radiated, and felt at peace. Until the priestess spoke, saying that he would protect him. Then a beam of light pierced his chest. It was an incredible feeling of warm, pure power. The shield would prioritize the life of its bearer above all else, and the location of the vow was the heart. In other words, it would stay with Kale until his last heartbeat. He commented on how pleasant it felt, and it seemed like the shield had wrapped around his heart and was doing its best to take care of it. Ancient powers like this leave a characteristic mark when activated, just like he had read in the novel. If he activated the power now, the indestructible shield would appear before his eyes. And that's exactly what happened, the item glowing in front of him as it floated. The object was supposed to be able to block at least 2 of Choi Han's attacks. Despite the name, the indestructible shield could, in fact, be destroyed. If it received more damage than it could handle, it would break after protecting the owner's heart, using the heart's energy to restore itself afterward. The pulsing heart was the shield's strength, so if Kim strengthened his heart, the shield would also become stronger. And he planned to do that during the trip to the capital. He wanted to withstand attacks at Choi Han's level for at least 5 minutes. That was what he was thinking as he observed the item carefully. However, something deeply bothered him. The shield seemed too divine, but he would let others fight in his place, so he wouldn't be using it that often anyway. Back at his house, during a relentless rain, the redhead came across the 2 cats he had interacted with when he first met Choi Han. The animals purred, rubbing against his leg, and he let out a long sigh. As he entered holding the 2 soaked animals, Hans asked what was going on, and the young master handed him the cats, telling him to take care of both. The vice butler was confused, but it was impossible to resist 2 adorable, fluffy kittens. He asked if he could take care of them permanently, and Kim said to do whatever he wanted. But he warned that the 2 behaved better when fed and that they were siblings. That last part made the animals nervous. They gave off a scent of medicinal herbs and a subtle smell of bread. The answer was obvious and gave a slight smirk, asking if they thought he would notice. The silver kitten was probably the older sister, and the red one the younger brother. Cute, the redhead said he would talk to them later, leaving Hans even more confused in the middle of the situation. He asked where Ron was, and the blonde asked if Choi Han would accompany him at the start of the trip to the capital while playing with the kitten. Then he explained that they had gone shopping for the trip along with B-Crocs, which relieved the MC. It seemed the trio was getting along, which was a good sign. But his expression changed when Hans mentioned that they seemed happy to serve the young master. Not far from there, at the piggy bank bookstore, Kim commented that the rain had scared off all the shop's customers, receiving a warm welcome from Billows. And he explained that he said he would come back, so he was there to keep that promise. Smiling, the blonde nodded, asking if he should prepare the same book and tea as last time, which the redhead confirmed, heading up the stairs toward his table. He looked sulky, staring out the window, and Billows arrived with the order, trying to force a conversation about the city's weather. He handed the tea to the noble, who thought that the only one missing now was the chubby guy to wrap things up. Not that he was an important character early in the story, but he would swear loyalty to Choi Han to reveal his true ambitions at some point. All he ever wanted was to be recognized by his father and brother. He had always been a greedy person. Even though he was a pain in the ass, having greed and ambition made him seem more human, so Kim didn't hate him. Billows broke the silence by commenting that he knew he was heading to the capital, making the MC's eyes widen. He asked why that was relevant, and the short guy revealed that he was probably going too right after the boy. Since he had met with Choi, it made sense that he would do that in the novel. The blonde smiled, saying the young master seemed different from the nickname, felt like he had changed. Sipping his tea, Kim confirms he was referring to the nickname Trash, and the guy nods, asking if it hadn't always been like that. The comment makes the MC wonder if he shouldn't have drunk a bit more and broken a few chairs. Then, with malice in his eyes, he says, "You can't call your father father or your brother brother. Are you really sure you want to keep living as the bastard?" He questions whether he's truly satisfied with that role. Before he can answer, Kim says he knew that wasn't the case, and he says he acted like trash for about 10 years, starting when he was 8. Suddenly, Choi Han and Ron enter the room, but the guy continues, explaining that there's no problem leaving behind something you've done for a long time. For example, you couldn't keep being trash forever, and he asks if the same didn't apply to Billows. The bastard covers his eyes like he's ashamed to cry in front of the protagonist. But when he responds that he really was tired of that life, there's malice in his eyes and a sly grin on his lips. Hearing his words, the redhead smiles while the 2 men watch the scene. Billows smiles, saying he'll see him in the capital, but the redhead doesn't understand why that meeting would happen, since he had to be involved with Choi Han. The blonde doesn't answer his question, but exchanges glances with the pair before leaving. He had passed by the hero exactly like in the novel. Kim tells Ron that he knew he'd bring the boy along, but Hans says that B-Crocs was with them, suggesting he had gone back to the kitchen. The butler asks if his young master owns the place, which he says is not the case, and the old man nods. He was curious about everything. Kim wouldn't worry if it were someone else asking the same question in his place, but he made him nervous. Friendly, Choi Han says that apparently rumors can't be trusted, which confuses our boy. Billows brings more tea for the redhead and offers it to the guests, explaining he had placed the order beforehand. It was hot lemon tea, the same kind Ron made every morning, and the MC explains that's why he asked for that flavor. The old man stares him up and down in silence, remembering the drinks he used to offer his boss. But Choi Han looks shocked. Normally, the butler brings the cup to his mouth and drinks without complaining. The hero asks what was the need for Ron to bang the cup on the saucer after drinking the tea, but gets no answer. The old man was lost in his own head. After the last fight between them and B-Crocs, his son had insisted on getting a rematch with that bastard. But even with the smell of red ink on his body, Choi Han said he'd only protect people from now on. Even Kale said he could. Now he had heard something even more interesting. The young master wouldn't keep being trash forever. As time passed, the trio decided to leave. Billow says he'll only see the MC in the capital, but he quickly replies that he'll be coming by every day for a while to clear his mind. The blonde says goodbye to the young man, saying his tea house would always be open to him. Ron watches in disgust, commenting that apparently it is possible to start liking others even without liking them before. And Choi Han cuts him off quickly, stating he had zero interest in liking him. But he wasn't talking about the dumb hero. He considers asking his son to prepare meals that the little pup they call Master might like for his trip. Not that he thought Kale wasn't trash, but the first thing he did when his mother passed was console his father, and even though he came home drunk all the time, he never caused trouble for the new family. Though extremely annoying, he'd been watching his changes for a while. Back at home, Kim was welcomed by the 2 knee cats he had completely forgotten about. He should have called Choi Han over to see the animals, since he knew the servant loved small animals. The boy introduces himself, saying he was going to his room because his heart needed to grow stronger so he could become someone capable of protecting others. Our boy thought all that was ridiculous, but Hans called his attention to something else. He wanted to hear the young master's opinion about how he had been taking care of the cats. Now they were even cuter, even though they still didn't let the blonde pet them. He was really happy in that role as a cat slave, and Kim noticed they were so healthy it felt like they had always lived there. What kind of witchcraft had Hans used for such a drastic change? The new caretaker of the critters says goodbye, but asks to be called if the little creatures need anything. No one more passionate had ever been born. With the subject closed, the boy told Ron that he was going to take a bath. Meanwhile, the old man stared at the 2 furballs, saying they must be from the cat tribe, which was a great thing. They looked stressed as he suggested the silver one used mist, while the red one used poison. Their tribe was known for perception and agility, and they would be very useful if trained properly. Stretching out his hand with a wicked look toward the cats, Ron was determined to give a wonderful farewell gift to his little young master. Later, the 2 little furballs meowed to get Kim's attention, and he asked if they were going to keep following him. They rubbed against him, and he already had a plan for both. As they kept meowing, he asked them to speak in the human tongue to make things easier. Then the kids said they wanted to eat meat and cake. The MC assured them they would get plenty of food if they obeyed him, and the kittens declared they would be useful. 4 days later, the family gathered in the dining hall. It was the day of Kim's journey, but Daruth commented that his son didn't seem very nervous. While the boy was just glad to be unharmed, since last night he should have been obliterated by Choi, which hadn't happened. Besides, ever since he got the indestructible shield, he felt its presence protecting him all the time, which was comforting because even if someone like Ron or B-Crocs tried to wipe him out, he would at least survive once. He finally said something, agreeing with his father, and commented that the number of guards had increased again, even after he asked for them to be reduced. Before Daruth could respond, Madame Violin revealed that it was her request, because she couldn't let people think their family was poor or unworthy just because the MC wanted to travel with so few servants. But she clarified she wasn't calling him unworthy, only that even she knew people cared too much about appearances, especially nobles. His stepmother was the eldest daughter of a poor baron's family. She dreamed of becoming the leader of a merchant guild when she grew up, but she was captivated by the luxury goods sold to nobles, went to Hennetus, fell in love with carving, met Daruth, and became the director of their cultural business. She was very proud of her journey and her family. Violin went on to say that many believe appearance said everything about a person. Understanding the woman's reasoning, Kim concluded that he also wanted several people handling his problems on the trip. He had even gotten used to changing clothes with help. However, a crazy black dragon would soon go berserk and berserk, and if he couldn't save it in time, the death toll would be unimaginable. Even if he didn't care about anyone other than himself, he definitely didn't like seeing people get destroyed right in front of him, much less taking responsibility for the wounded. But all he said to the woman was that the eyes are the mirror of the soul. She realized the young man understood that sculpting wasn't just about creating a work of art, but rather about creating a reflection of what's in your heart. Kim said he had read that on the plaque at the gallery for writers. Appearance doesn't matter. Personally engraved by Violin. Finally, the woman said she would reduce the number of servants like her stepson wanted, on the condition that the carriage and everything else would be of the highest possible quality, the way they should present themselves to the world. Daruth looked at his inscrutable wife, but he changed the subject to ask if his son had checked the information about the personalities of the noble children who would attend the event. He confirmed, commenting that there were some petty ones, others clever or intimidating, several idiots, and even some desperate for power. The father seemed surprised the boy had read the document he gave him, but told him that regardless of that, he should do whatever he wanted. Derwith moved on, starting a conversation about a strange rumor he had heard. Apparently, the man-eating tree had changed. People were saying it now looked like a tree with beautiful green leaves, even with grass around it. Kim wasn't stupid. He knew the man was aware of his visits to the slums, but he doubted he knew anything about the ancient power. Maybe he just suspected that the tree's change was related to him. The redhead only said it was an interesting rumor, and the patriarch agreed, though it was nothing major. However, he insisted on the subject, saying one should always pay attention to rumors, because there was nothing scarier than the people's eyes and mouths. Even if nothing bad would happen to his family in that territory, which was a relief for Kim, who longed for a peaceful life there. He just wanted to return soon from the capital to enjoy the rest of his life in peace and quiet. The young man says goodbye to his family, noticing a tense look on his younger siblings' faces. The youngest stammers as she wishes him a safe trip, and he thanks her, telling her to stay safe too. The gesture makes the little girl blush. Apparently, Kale was trashed to his siblings as well. The carriage is waiting when he walks down the stairs of his house. But as he approaches, he realizes something is very wrong. Inside the vehicle, Hans is lovingly watching the cats, and the redhead questions why their seat looks more comfortable than his. But the blonde argues that their kittens needed to travel comfortably since they were just babies. Kim stared at the scene in disbelief and was sure he only said that because he had no idea those two could emit fog and poison. Ron informs the young master that he'll be riding in the driver's cabin. Our boy was already getting settled when Choi Han caught his attention. He asks if they shouldn't be in the same carriage so he could protect him, which the redhead denies. Then the hero says he understands. It was strange. Until yesterday, he could see rage and thirst for revenge in the guy's eyes, but now it felt like he'd given up. Like that part in the novel where he traveled with a sword in his chest, but calm expression on his face. Not that was a bad thing. A tall guy confronts Choi, saying that wasn't his place. Kim knew there was someone like that in that territory, and he walks over to the young master to say they were ready to leave, this time with a smile. But he slams the door in his face before confirming they could go. The trip is long, and the redhead gets distracted wondering if he should ask Hans to arrange gifts for his family. He had asked his siblings if they wanted anything from the capital, which surprised the youngest. She says she wants a sword, which was unexpected, but the little girl stood firm. 7 years old and she wanted a sword. Basin explains that Lily's dream was to be a swordswoman, which made sense since every family member had an athletic build. The girl was taller than most kids her age, and with enough training, she'd become a great swordswoman. So he promised he'd bring her a really expensive sword, making her blush with excitement. As for Basin, he just wanted a fountain pen, which was simpler. When the carriage stops in the middle of the forest, Kim asks why. They find themselves in front of a group of bandits. The one who appeared to be the gang leader tells them to pay a toll if they want to cross the mountain, handing over everything they had. This kind of thing always happened in novels, and the young man asks if they couldn't see his family's crest on the side of the carriage. And the cats were thinking the same thing. Ron suggests they take a break before continuing, since there were lots of rabbits around, even though they were different from the ones he usually hunted as gifts. Outside the vehicle, he smiles, explaining that these rabbits wouldn't be hunted by him but by other people. Seriously, he was scarier than the bandits. Meanwhile, the boy estimates it would take about half a day to finish the hunt, which worried him, since they needed the same time to reach the dragon. At the makeshift table, dinner was served rabbit stew. But it didn't look like Ron had hunted the animals, which left Kim a little frustrated. And Choi Han was just wondering why the hell they had to hunt rabbits. The cats were begging for the tasty food the protagonist was ignoring, but he didn't move a muscle to feed them. However, of course, Hans, father of the year, had prepared some delicious dried meat for the kids, who ran over to him. The redhead watches Kale's other servants from a distance. They had fought a bunch of bandits earlier, but of course the one who actually finished them off was Choi Han. When the tall guy came to report that everything was taken care of, the young man showed up from behind to say it was an easy fight. Even with his face dirty, he said it wasn't even a warm-up, leaving the guy shocked. It wasn't a surprise to Kim after all. In the original story, the kid had beaten up a count's son. Imagine what he'd do to everyone else. Back at the table, Ron asks if the redhead had no appetite, and that's why he didn't eat much of the soup. He confirms, even if he's annoyed by his presence. Choi Han asks if he was feeling okay, and the boy explains that it wasn't that. He could probably eat everything if it weren't rabbits. Suddenly, the hero calls him. He immediately asks what he wants, and the dark-haired guy can't help but ask if that had been his first battle. Kim makes sure he was talking about the bandit incident, which he was. Then he confirmed he had never seen so many bandits before. Choi Han nodded, suggesting it was probably the first time the rich boy had ever had his life on the line. If only he knew what it had been like being around him these past few days. And he wasn't even the only one. Besides him, there was also an old man grinning wickedly while holding the rabbit he had hunted, and a man sharpening a knife right next to him. Surrounded by that kind of people, Kim felt like his heart was going to leap out of his mouth at any moment. Pushing the soup away, the MC had really lost his appetite. Choi Han called again, burning through his patience. and said the first time was always the hardest, which left the boy confused. The hero asked if his superior practiced any martial arts, but he replied that he didn't need to. Still, the boy insisted that he should at least be strong enough to protect himself. Kim explained that he was very strong and told him to look at all those people protecting him. Besides that, he trusted his heart and knew he would survive. Of course, all of that was thanks to the shield, and even so, he still had to avoid people like Choi Han. The hero stared at him along with the cats. Then he turned away, saying he was going to train his swordsmanship more, making the protagonist question if he was really going to do that right after a meal. But all the swordsman said was that he felt like he needed to get stronger. What did he want? To get strong enough to destroy the whole planet? He was definitely kind of a lunatic. B. Crocs handed a plate of food to the boy, who thanked him, and Ron commented that acidic drinks like lemonade were great for opening up one's appetite. But he was interrupted by the vice captain yelling for everyone to start the afternoon training, probably motivated by Choi Han. Back on the road, Kim couldn't get the dragon out of his head. In 3 days, the creature would cause a man explosion. They were passing through the lands of the Viscount. At the foot of the mountain, there was a house under his ownership. In a cave behind that house, the black dragon was hiding. The house might belong to the Viscount, but that was the same as saying it belonged to Marquis Stan. Bingen Stan was the Marquis's second son, who became heir after crippling his older brother. He visited the Viscount's house from time to time. If he didn't torture the dragon for fun, Kim wouldn't have to go through all this danger. Hans called his attention, saying the young master must be very tired, so he and Choi Han would look for an inn nearby. But the MC said whatever. Watching the interaction between the two servants, the redhead asked Choi Han to return quickly, and the boy smiled, saying he would. His reaction was strangely cheerful, which the protagonist found unexpected. There was definitely something off. However, an old man stepped into the path of another carriage speeding down the road and was quickly saved by Choi Han. It was a total cliche, but once they managed to stop, the boy jumped down to check the situation. His vice captain was shocked, asking if he was going to go see it personally, which the boy responded by asking who else would go instead. And he wasn't surprised when he saw that the vehicle belonged to Vingen Stan, the typical authoritarian hero. Just like the stereotypical villain of The Birth of a Hero, a tall woman asked how Choi Han dared stand in the way of a noble, but he was furious and said the old man could have gotten hurt. He even said they were driving the carriage like maniacs, to which she replied that commoners should get out of the way when they see a noble's carriage. Moreover, looking at the old man on the ground with disdain, she claimed it was his own fault for being dumb enough to stand in the middle of the road. Her words made the hero furious, but before he could say anything, Vingen placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, saying that was enough. Hans whispered to the redhead that Choi Han seemed really pissed, and our boy also seemed bothered by the situation. Holding the swordsman back, the MC suggested he stop too, which the boy tried to argue, because the nobles could have changed direction but didn't and almost hurt someone. It was hard to ignore. Even so, Kim insisted, asking him to calm down. Looking closely at the stuck-up noble, he noticed that the cuff of his clothes seemed stained with ink, probably from torturing the poor dragon. Ignoring the tension, Vingen greeted Kale, saying it was a pleasure and confirming that he was a member of the Hennetus family. The boy confirmed, returning the greeting, even though he thought the guy was a psychopathic lunatic. And the blonde commented that one of the Hennetus had a free spirit and didn't seem like a noble, saying he missed Basin, and asked if the redhead was going to his place. Then Kim claims to be the trash from the rumors, probably one of the biggest pieces of trash among all trash, which the noble finds quite interesting. He says that even if an obstacle had made him waste time since he met young Master Kale, it was worth it. However, he suggests he should teach his subordinate to properly distinguish who has the right to walk freely and who should bow before that right. Then the old man, who had been silent the entire time, bows to Vingen, desperately begging for forgiveness. The residents of each territory behave according to the personality of the noble who governs them. Since the Viscount was Stan's lapdog, he was very authoritarian. Tired of that talk, Kim asks if the guy had anything else to discuss, which he doesn't. He didn't give a damn if Choi Han ended up beating the heir senseless, but it couldn't happen while the situation was connected to him. So he turns to the old man, wanting to know where he could find a bar around there. Since he seems not to understand, he repeats the question, justifying that he needed a good drink so he wouldn't wake up tired the next day, and extends his hand to say goodbye to Vingen, who looks at him with suspicion. His subordinate warns that they're late, but is rudely interrupted by the blonde, who scolds her for interrupting a conversation between nobles. Smiling as if he were polite, he bids farewell to the redhead with a strangely quick handshake. Returning the fake politeness, Kim invites him to drink together if they meet in the capital, since he seemed like such a wonderful person. Praising him, he adds that only young Master Vingen deserves to be the future leader of the Stan family. With the same lousy acting, the hare says that Kale is a very pleasant and free-spirited individual and hopes they'll meet again. Watching him leave, Kim can only think he had absolutely no desire to see him again, and even if they did meet, he hoped they'd be far apart. Trying to comfort Choi, he says that half the nobles are like that anyway. Squatting down, he asks the old man if he hurt his leg and requests that the hero take him home safely, but the man says he's fine and could take him to the bar. The boy asks him to forget it, saying he wasn't in the mood, but is cut off by the gray-haired man who insists he has drinks at his bar. Kim is surprised to learn that guy owns a bar, and he explains it's the only inn in the village, but they also serve food and drinks. Since they're the only one, they must be selling the best there is. So he orders Hans to learn the way from the man and take them to the place. Meanwhile, Choi Han asks if his boss isn't angry, which leaves him confused. Asking if he was referring to the way Vingyan looked down on him, the advice on what to do with the hero, or almost eliminating the old man and still calling him an obstacle. He wanted to know if he expected him to say that the old man should have apologized instead, but he had no right to say those things. Besides, he didn't want to and wasn't even angry. Life had taught him that sometimes you need to show a little power and endure a bit of irrationality. And that bastard would be kicked out of his house soon anyway. His statement confuses Choi Han. How did he know that? Then Kim says he'll steal that bastard's dragon, which doesn't clarify much. At the inn, the man presents the best room to the young master, who finds it quite decent. He explains that it's the first time they're hosting a noble, so he asks for understanding, even if it's too humble a place for someone like the redhead. The young man tells him to relax. It was natural to be nervous, but he found all that excessive hospitality a bit uncomfortable, and he says he doesn't like people who humiliate themselves so much. If the people from his territory rested in that inn, there was no reason it wouldn't please him too. That makes the man thoughtful for a moment, until he asks if there are that many good people like him in the Henitu's territory. But the young man smiles, asking what he's talking about. He's the worst trash in the whole territory. Besides, practically anyone you meet there would have a better personality than his. Finally, he dismisses the old man, who bows on his way out, irritating the protagonist. When he hears knocks at the door, Kim tells the person to come in. It's Hans, holding a box that his master had requested. Since he won't take his eyes off the small chest, our boy assumes he's curious about the contents. So he reminds him that butlers shouldn't show emotion, but he replies that one of the proper etiquettes is to show all emotions to the master. Kim finds him cheeky, which Hans proudly agrees with. But already out of patience, the boy tells him to leave. Before passing through the door, he asks if they'll be staying there for 3 days, and the MC nods, asking him to take care of everything. Lying in bed, Kim thought about how there were people taking care of everything for him. Even if he was scared, Hans had no trouble serving him. He was a great butler. Looking at the box, the cats asked to see what was inside. Then the boy finally opened the chest, explaining that it contained things to help save a poor creature, screw over an idiot, and prevent himself from getting hurt. Flashbacks of his negotiation with Billows ran through his mind, remembering how nosy he was and how he kept insisting on knowing the fate of those items. Even so, the blonde had said it would be very expensive to buy all the items, which made the redhead ask if he could rent them instead. And despite laughing at the proposal, he confirmed he could rent them, but only for him, with the caveat that 2 of them couldn't be rented to outsiders, so he'd rent them in his own name and have Kale return them personally in the capital. Displaying a small black ball to the silver cat, the MC sparked her curiosity. He explained it was a mana disruptor worth nearly $1 billion, which shocked them both. He had to spend $20 million just to rent it. With it, he could disable all surveillance tools within the radius of a mountain. However, it needed to be installed a day before being used and only stayed active for exactly 40 minutes. It was quite expensive for a single tool, but the fact that it was tough enough not to break pleased him greatly. When Kim rolled the ball on the floor, the sisters poked at it curiously, and he asked if they knew how to read maps, which they did, since they were in the succession line of the Miss Cat tribe. So the boy opened up his map on the ground for them to see, pointing to the village where they were, more specifically, the mountain to its right. He explained that if they headed toward it, they'd find a house, warning them not to get close to it, because they might get caught. The redhead revealed the location of the dragon hatchling, stating they would save it from the torture happening there. Han was surprised it was a hatchling even younger than him. His sister got excited about saving it, but Kim shoved her down by saying they were just going to free it. That's why he needed them to stay in cat form, bury a pouch with the little ball near the mountain, and then return. The older one asked her to bury it, but it could be anywhere in the area. It was easy. They had already escaped the elders to flee their old tribe. This would be no big deal, and the boy assured them that he would never ask for something if he didn't believe in their potential. Plus, he'd give them all the meat they wanted once they got back. So the 2 furballs headed off for their mission. Sitting at the table, Kim realized he was already getting used to Ron's lemonade, but Choi Han broke the silence to ask if there was a problem. Then he asked if the hero had ever met a dragon before. Making sure he heard it right, he explained that he had seen something similar, which made Kim wonder if the guy was saying that the evil monsters from the Forest of Darkness looked like dragons and asked him to clarify. But all he had to say about the creature he saw was that its appearance and strength resembled a dragon. In that case, the protagonist said he hadn't seen anything like a dragon, which confused Choi. He explained that dragons were like humans, not just them, but dwarves and elves too, since all of them had emotions and lives. However, if a being like that was trapped in darkness since birth, living without ever seeing or knowing what the sun is like, it was different. The noble asked what kind of life his subordinate thought such a being would be living. Forced to be an irrational creature, with no family or anyone to protect it, tortured and abused every day, only finding peace when it was almost destroyed. His words made Choi Han look downcast. a reaction that was expected. There was no way a good person like him wouldn't get angry after hearing all that. And wrapping it up, he said it was even worse when that creature was nearby. Noticing his silence, Kim wondered if the hero was that upset because of the dragon being tortured. When he finally opened his mouth, the boy asked if the young master intended to tame the beast after saving it. To which the MC replied, "Are you out of your mind? Why would I tame it?" Leaving the hero surprised, like a dragon tortured by humans would ever accept that. Besides, dragons are a race that feels superior to all others, including humans with extremely arrogant personalities. But the most important reason Kim would never raise a dragon was how predictable all the accidents would be in that scenario. After all, there were fewer than 20 dragons in that world. So creating one was like painting a target on your back throughout everything happening there. Since he wasn't going to create it, Choi Han asks what he intended to do with the creature. However, it was obvious to Kim that it would be set free to fly wherever it wanted, and he needed the swordsman's help to release it. With great excitement, the boy says he'd do anything to help, but the protagonist makes it clear that they wouldn't need to kill anyone. On the contrary, he wanted to resolve it in the most discreet way possible. Praising his master, the hero says he always knew he was different. Changing the subject, the redhead asks him to talk to Ron and bring a drink from the first floor. Already at the bar, he questions if it was okay to let the noble drink that much, and Hans explains that as long as he didn't have anything in his hands, everything was safe. Meanwhile, Kim compliments the alcohol from the place, and the old man says it was a specialty of the village, made with fruits and herbs from the mountain. That's why it was so pricey. Looking at the bottle, the MC notices there was still a lot of liquid inside, since it was huge. So he asks for a few more to serve the entire team, which his vice captain thinks is unnecessary. But the guy says they should drink up because that was an order, and he calls Choi Han to help him get to his room and rest. When the guard offers to go in his place, the hero asks him to rest for a while with the other soldiers, saying he'd handle everything. Kim argues that nothing dangerous was going to happen there, suggesting that the rest of the guards take the day off. That catches the vice captain by surprise, but even so, he keeps walking, hoping the guard won't follow him. Meanwhile, Ron watches him go up the stairs. Even if he didn't care about what the MC did, he wouldn't enjoy dealing with anything annoying, so he knew it was better to be warned in advance. So the redhead explains that he's going out and asks him to keep it a secret. At the door of the room, he says he's going to sleep and orders them to wake him only in case of an emergency. After all, they knew what would happen if they disturbed his sleep. So Hans wishes him a great night while the old man says he'll be right behind the door if needed. Loud and clear, Kim dismisses Choi Han in front of the staff. But before he leaves, he whispers in his ear, "Coming in through the window after the sun sets." The young man doesn't reply, just stares at his boss before walking away. As night falls, the cats get ready, asking the new guardian if it was time. Besides them, the hero enters through the window, just as he was told. Surprised by the new outfit of the young master, he doesn't even have time to say anything because the MC orders him to wear the same clothes. When questioned about it, our boy thinks it's obvious that it was the uniform of the secret organization responsible for the disaster in Choi's village. The novel explained the details of this uniform, probably because the protagonist, Choi Han, constantly faced the organization throughout the story. The quality was kinda low, but good enough from a distance, and people would remember the star symbol, not the quality of the uniforms. Looking at Kim, the swordsman asks if they were going to do something bad, which he confirms, explaining that it would be something awful for that bastard Vinian Stan. Even if he seems hesitant, the young man asks him to hand over a uniform, and so our boy does. He knew Choi Han was a good guy, but he also knew people would always want revenge on what they hate. Remembering the mission partners, he explains that the kittens were from the cat tribe. In other words, they were peace folk. And he introduces the silver cat, On, and the red one, Hong, to the warrior, who looks tense before they head out. Arriving at the forest, Kim was counting the seconds until the right moment to act. Finally, the team gets the green light to advance, running through the forest ahead. Only the high-quality magical alarms were going off, which was a sign that the voice-altering and mana interference device was working. Since the sound wasn't very loud, most of the low-quality alarms didn't even trigger. Suddenly, an armed knight charges at Choi, who had just struck down his companion with his sword. Then, drawing his blade, the man asks who he was and what he was doing there. But the answer never comes, since the boy's approach is to hit him with a precise strike. While watching the blonde groaning in pain, other members of Vinian's army surround him, stunned by his presence. At that moment, Kim invokes On's Miss Power, who charges forward, leaving the officers confused by the smoke. They finally spot the noble, who wastes no time and immediately asks his swordsman to protect him as soon as he's noticed. The leader of the trio orders his subordinates to stop them, but the swordsman alone manages to defeat the duo in an instant, surprising the boy. He couldn't take his eyes off Choi, who was slicing through everyone like ham. Even Kim was impressed. It only took a single blow to take down everyone there. Still, the knight walks up to him, wondering where the hell a guy like that came from. Choi Han seemed possessed by something unnameable upon hearing all that noise. Running to enter the cave, the redhead says he'll leave that situation in the boy's hands, who stares the enemy down seriously and says, no one will pass. Inside the dungeon, another knight was panicking upon realizing that the mana crystal ball wasn't working. When he encounters the redhead, he bombards him with questions that made it clear how scared he was, which made sense since Venyan had set up a self-destruction device on the torturer in case of intruders. And if he exploded, the cave would be destroyed even with Kim inside, which made the MC raise his hands in surrender. Even so, the blonde insists he step away, choking on the poison running through his system. When his opponent finally collapses to the ground, the boy takes the chance to grab the key to the cell holding the dragon, and thanks the little ones for a job well done. Soon, the three head toward the beast, which looked more like a plush toy sleeping peacefully and covered in wounds. Kim could smell the blood coming from it. Opening the cell, he tries to get the little one's attention, who only wakes up upon hearing the words, "Let's go," coming from his savior's mouth. It had an incredible gaze that hypnotized the protagonist. Next to the fallen knight, the siblings get nervous about their guardian taking so long. They're caught off guard when they see his image holding the tiny dragon in his arms. It was covered in wounds, which looked extremely painful. Before Alan could say anything, the redhead cuts in, saying he already knew. Either way, he already planned to use the healing potion on the creature, but before that, he needed to remove the mana-restricting collar for it to work properly. The boy thinks for a moment, but an alert goes off in his head when he realizes Venyan is on the way. Observing the place calmly, he tries to find the escape route. The novel said that the disgusting noble had an installed route in case of an invasion. Not even the torturer knew about it, but it was written in the story that a smooth part on the wall would reveal the secret tunnel. When he finally finds it, Kim remembers he should be able to escape through there as long as they broke through that wall with a decent amount of force. Choi-Han suddenly appears in the room, which makes him check that everything is ready. A roar from the little dragon grabs the swordsman's attention, who seems surprised by the creature's presence. But he quickly turns to the young master to explain that, as requested, he spared the employees who ran, taking down only those who wanted to fight. Now his new task was to punch that wall, which confuses him, and he asked if he should do it with full force. Afraid he might destroy the entire cave, the redhead asks him to imagine a wall 10 centimeters thick, which would equal a weak punch. It was kind of humiliating to think that something he couldn't even do was like a weak punch to the guy. So Choi-Han does it, opening a hole that led directly to the secret passage. The group moves forward until they reach the outside of the dungeon, which makes the little guy's eyes sparkle with freedom. Putting him down, Kim asks him to stop staring since he was only helping. To be honest, he liked the dragon. It was different from himself, who had given up when he was just a mistreated orphan. He calls the creature, holding a huge pair of scissors in his hands. Grabbing it by the neck, scaring the little thing, our boy frees it from the torture that was the mana collar. The creature seems surprised by the act, even though Kim stays expressionless. Bothered by its piercing stare, the boy asks what it's looking at, and handing the gloves to Choi, he explains that he should grab the mana-filled collar, which was still active, using those. Opening the vial of healing potion, he approaches the dragon, who growls at his approach, and he asks if it had any idea how much he spent on that thing. Then he holds the creature's face, which tenses up, remembering all the times it had been mistreated. But it's caught off guard when the MC makes it drink, even calling it an idiot while wishing it well. Once the potion is finished, a blue aura surrounds the little thing, who is amazed to see its wounds closing up. Kim calls its attention to ask what they should do from then on. He knew the little one could speak since it belonged to the most intelligent and powerful species around, and he asks what the creature would like to do once it's free. Shy, the little one says it will live, which brings a smile to Kim's face. Adding to that, it says it will leave and never be tamed. Hearing those words, the redhead encourages it to go, saying it has the right to live freely. However, upon realizing the boy wouldn't stay with it, the beast roars that he's nothing but a liar, because all humans are great liars, something the redhead agrees with. Still, he says the creature should live however it wants. In other words, freely. Then he turns his back to the dragon, which watches his movements in disbelief. That should be enough for Kim. He freed the dragon, saved the village from disaster, and even screwed over Venyan. In doing so, he helped Choi-Han learn what freedom meant. And of course, the most important part, he wouldn't need to take responsibility for the little creature. Standing still while watching the group leave, the dragon concludes that it hates humans because they're all evil. Meanwhile, the kittens wondered whether their new friend would follow them or not. Noticing how excited they were about having a new little brother, Kim laughs, saying it would be impossible. He explains that dragons are extremely prideful and would never accept orders from a human. Besides, that one in particular probably hates humans. They had been tortured, so it made sense they wouldn't be gaining a younger brother. Still in the forest, the redhead sends the two cats to bring back the orb they had hidden, waiting right there. It was the first time Choi-Han had saved someone, so Kim felt the need to congratulate him. Although he had fought those bandits before, it had been more to protect someone than to save them. Now he had saved the dragon instead of the village since the story had changed, but even so, he was a hero. The boy calls out to Kale, a bit hesitant, and he asks what he would do if the dragon decided to follow him, though the MC swore that wouldn't happen. Even so, Choi-Han insists on the question. That makes the redhead pause for a moment. But instead of giving his subordinate a clear answer, he shrugs, explaining that he doesn't think about what-ifs or the past. Finally, they return to the inn to rest after the successful mission. While the noble sleeps, a blue light glows beside him. It's the dragon cub, lying on his windowsill, clutching the empty vial of healing potion it had taken, without the young man knowing. The next day, Kim and Choi-Han are sitting at the table having breakfast. Apparently, the redhead was starting to feel the effects of last night's drinking. On top of that, he had slept poorly, as if someone had been watching him. Pushing aside thoughts about his miserable condition, he checks to make sure his swordsman had taken care of everything. And Choi-Han confirms that he'd erased all traces leading to the inn, replacing them with fake ones heading west. However, he mentions that there seemed to be a city just a few days' travel by carriage from there, and asks if that was the place the young master had mentioned before. The young man agrees, explaining that it was Purcell, the city where they would part ways, and says it had taken a while to get there since they had to cross the mountains, but it would be easier to reach the capital now that they'd only follow paved roads. Catching the redhead's attention, Choi-Han reveals that along the way he checked the Viscount's estate, saying he found chaos with soldiers and knights leaving the village. Unbothered, the MC assumes they were just going to report the incident, but something was bothering the swordsman. Then he says the escape tunnel was blown up along with the cave entrance, the trees, the grass, and the surrounding soil. Everything was destroyed. Even so, Kim's expression remains calm, and all he says is that it must have been the dragon. The statement shocks the three subordinates. Standing up from the table, the MC says it's a relief that no one nearby was harmed, since the beast must have been holding back out of fear. And he smiles, thinking the little one must have destroyed the tunnel so no one could pass through it, and the surroundings to eliminate the magical devices set up there. Dragons are a species sensitive to mana, he explains. Despite being only 4 years old, he's very clever. Choi-Han understands, commenting that he felt a lot of mana there, and the redhead says that's why you should never underestimate a dragon, ending the topic and dismissing the boy. Before he leaves, our boy asks if the warrior plans to sleep until departure, but he says he's going to help Beecrox. Apparently, they were getting along well. However, the young man quickly states that the two were not getting along at all. Kim couldn't help but find the boy really weird. But all he says is to ask Hans to bring him some drinks, leaving Choi-Han confused. Wasn't he feeling bad because of the drinks? Looking at the clock, the noble asks if he didn't know alcohol cured hangovers. While walking down the stairs, the protagonist wonders why the hero wouldn't just come down already instead of standing in his way. He's grumpy upon noticing his vice captain interacting with one of the knights who had been defeated the night before. Bumping into Choi on purpose, he asks what he was afraid of, and the young man explains that he thought he used enough strength to incapacitate the officers for at least a day, but that the guy was awake and walking around. Apparently, he had underestimated humans. He'd used more strength against them now, which made Kim think that the guy really was a cliché protagonist who destroys everything in the name of justice. Sitting at one of the tables, the MC is greeted by the innkeeper, carrying the same drink he had the night before. Then he asks the old man if he knows what he thinks the more he sees him, making the old man tense. Surprisingly, the young man smiles, saying he thought he was a great salesman. He had brought the perfect drink to cure his morning hangover. Meanwhile, the vice captain assures Vinyan's knight that no one left the inn the day before, but didn't understand why that information mattered to him. The man reveals that a thief had broken into the Viscount's house the night before and stole some things, so they wanted to know if they had been victims too. Turning the bottle in his hand, Kim thinks that dragon thieves are still dragons. When he slams the bottle on the table, the officer stares at him, deeply irritating him. Clearing his throat dryly, the vice captain explains that his master gets grumpy if he doesn't have his morning drink, which is what he was doing now. He says it was a hangover drink, which finally spooks the guy. Kim sighs, since at least the suspicion that the thief was one of them disappeared. Now that he'd seen what kind of person Kale was, he'd never think he'd do something like that. There was no way to find a connection between the secret organization and him. The young man calls Ron, asking for a cup of lemon and honey tea to cure his hangover, which surprises the old man. And while drinking, he thought that even if they followed the tracks, they'd never find the real culprits behind the dragon's escape. From what little he knew of Vinyan, he was probably fuming with rage at that moment. Taylor Stan was the eldest son and the only good person in the Marquis's family. But thanks to his brother, he became paralyzed from the waist down and lost his position as heir. He searched through countless documents in pursuit of a power that could heal his legs, but there were no records of anything like that. Still, when you hit rock bottom, the only way out is to climb upright. By coincidence, the boy found the small clue in an ancient book. There was a flood of information. He read about restoration and stone towers, doing his best to understand the old literature. When he managed to decipher 2 words that led him to a place unlike anything ever seen before. Back to Kim's journey, the cats ask if they were going to camp that night. He confirms, explaining that it would become a regular thing from that point on. They have to hurry to have enough time in the city of Purcell. The reason for going there was the presence of an ancient power even stronger than the boy's indestructible shield. It was the vitality of the heart, the power that Taylor so desperately sought, and something that would further strengthen Kim's shield. Deep down, he felt bad about stealing the former heir's last hope, but he needed it more since he was heading to the capital. The eldest son must have known that such power had restorative and vitality traits, but he didn't know it was useless in a body already damaged. In the end, he fell into despair after obtaining it. Even with all the effort it took, it wouldn't be enough to save his life from his brother. On pulls the protagonist out of the memory by mentioning that Hans had said that if you made a wish at the stone tower, it would come true. And with sparkling eyes, the siblings lament that it'd be a shame if they couldn't at least see it once. But when Kim asks what they would wish for, they say they'd ask for their little brother to go with the group, making the wish immediately denied. On tries to console Ham, who looks devastated. As time passes, the carriage makes its stop to set up camp as soon as the sun begins to set. The next morning, the presence of a downed elk makes the redhead question how it ended up there, and Hans suggests that someone had left it there. Noticing two drawings in the dirt in front of the animal, Kim tries to figure out what they mean. That person probably knew how to communicate but didn't know how to use letters. The whole situation gave the young man a bad feeling. While Choi-han smiles like a fool, he watches him. The hero had kept watch all night, so he was pretending not to know what it was about. He already knew. It must have been that little brat, a dragon. Thinking about it, our boy decides to play dumb. However, at the next campsite Ray slept, another creature showed up with the same symbols. It hadn't given up even after being ignored. This kept happening at every stop they made, over and over again. Kim was already full of rage at this nonsense and prayed the creature wouldn't follow him into the city. This time, Choi-han comments on the incident, comparing the creature to a cute child who never lost its innocence. But the protagonist was only wondering about the dragon's motivation for doing this. He was hoping it would destroy the Marquis's family once it got stronger. In fact, the Henatu's territory would become even more peaceful if that happened. Upon arriving in the city, the cats admired the houses with stone towers, their eyes sparkling. But the MC explains that it was a stone tower city. In front of the lodging where they would stay, Kim makes sure it was indeed the right place. And Hans answers enthusiastically that yes, it was, and that they arrived just after the Stone Tower Festival, so the rooms were really cheap. Upon hearing that it was strange to have a festival like that in a stone city, he prepares to tell the sad story behind the tradition, which doesn't really interest the MC. Even so, the butler insists on starting his tale, and when he hears it's a legend that began back in ancient times, the redhead seems more willing to listen. So serving himself a glass of wine, he asks him to go on. According to the servant, the legend said that the city had lost the grace of a god in the past. This surprises the young man, as it was the first time he heard anything like that about Purcell, which Hans suggests is a result of Kale never studying history, irritating Kim with a response. He challenges him to keep talking back like that, but the blonde simply explains it's the butler's duty to inform his master of things he doesn't know. Continuing the story, the man states that no one knew for sure why the city lost the god's grace, but that's when the stone towers began. They were like silent prayers, and Kim asks if they even worked, but that wasn't the case. Apparently, none of the wishes had been granted. That was even the reason why there were no temples in the city of Purcell. The redhead says that if a god abandoned him, there'd be no reason to worship it either, and innocently, Hans praises his master's intelligence, even without studying. And he goes back to the story, explaining that this was why they had stone towers instead of temples there. Even today, they represent a promise with the citizens and with themselves, and Kim asks what he was talking about. To which Hans reveals that anyone whose wish was granted would destroy their stone tower. Smiling, the protagonist comments that it was a pretty interesting city, something the butler agrees with, acknowledging that the citizens had to rely on their own strength to reach their goals. Our boy supposes that if destroying the tower represented the struggle against adversity, then they weren't meant to ask for help from a god. His servant agrees, saying they were a representation of the people's determination. That's why he concludes it had nothing to do with a god in the end. And Hans nods, reaffirming that it's sad they were abandoned, but adds that the story gave people hope. Ending the blonde's story time, the young master asks him to look down. When he does, he sees the two kittens glaring at him angrily and wonders if they were hungry based on their expressions. But Kim didn't think that was the case. They looked like that because earlier, he had said all you had to do was make a wish to the towers and it would come true. Since he had no idea about that, the butler asked the kittens not to be mad. He would bring them some dried meat to eat. Then he asks the boss if he can step out for a moment, to which he replies that he doesn't even need to come back. Ignoring the comment, the blonde walks out, saying he'll be right back. Taking advantage of the peace, Kim tells Ron to go rest as well. And the old man asks if Choi-han was really leaving in 2 days, receiving a yes in response. With an ironic smile on his face, the MC asks if he was sad about the hero leaving, suggesting he wanted to go with him. But the old man smiles and says he would never abandon his master because he wanted to be by his side in the weirdest way possible. And he comments on wanting his company since his son would also be sad about the boy leaving. Soon the redhead says they can talk in the capital when they meet again. He was just thinking that the three of them could head to Rosalind's kingdom afterward. Formally, the old man states that he had been looking forward to this moment and only wished that everyone would arrive safely in the capital. as if Kim believed Ron could care about anyone's safety. Finally, he asked the old man to leave, staying alone with the two cats, who were teary-eyed over Han's lies. Completely ignoring the two, the protagonist remembers a character from the novel who lived until he was 150. Because of a power left behind by an ancient being after passing due to old age, the vitality of the heart. That man believed the power was a curse. The boy walks to the door, startling the butler by opening it suddenly. Without much explanation, Kim says they were going to see the stone tower, just the two of them and Choi. Oh, and the kittens. This 150-year-old man wanted to build a stone tower in a cave where the winds converge. For that, he spent years working hard but never managed to finish it. Now all the protagonist wanted to know was what he had wished for. It was decided, since he had to do it anyway, he'd build an amazing tower. Far from the hotel where they had been staying, the group was walking under the scorching sun during the day. But something catches the boy's attention. It was Taylor Stan being pushed by someone. His presence surprises the redhead a little, but there he was along with Cage, the priestess. Even though he came to see the stone towers, he also wanted to check out those two, since he only knew what they looked like physically. The noble asks why she came all the way there, and the woman responds that it was because of some shitty message from a god or something like that she saw in a dream. According to her, the dream showed that the future benefactor of the two of them would appear there, so they had to come, even if she didn't know exactly what that person would do. That last part gets to Taylor, who asks if there's anyone that God couldn't predict. To which the woman replies she doesn't know, since half of what he said was nonsense. But she's soon scolded by the boy. It also asks if she wasn't hiding the fact that she could hear the god's voice. However, Cage knew that no one cared or listened. It's not like the word of the god helped them with anything, especially feeding themselves. So she changes the subject, calling Taylor to go eat, but the boy catches her attention, saying that out of nowhere he felt like drinking beer. The woman seems to share the craving, commenting that she wanted some smoked pork, and the two burst out laughing. Taylor hurries her so they can kill their hunger, and she smiles, determined to give it her all, escorting him to the place. Meanwhile, Kim watches the interaction between the two, certain that he would remember them now. And since they didn't know him, he just needed to avoid them. Concluding the thought, Hans calls his young master, whispering that he just saw the eldest son of the Stan Marquis family, which makes the boy widen his eyes. He turns around to ask how he knew the noble, and the butler says he had all the information about them in his head, and the snake on his chair said a lot already. In what seems like an attempt at a compliment, the MC says that for an incompetent guy, the blonde was pretty competent, and the servant asks what he intended to do. But the plan was simple. He was going to ignore them. Arriving at the place the group had been looking forward to, Kim could only think about how everything looked unexpectedly normal. Not that he expected some ancient architecture or anything, but it was just too normal. To the point where even the kids were disappointed. However, Choi Han was frozen to the ground like a statue in front of the stones, which made the MC wonder if he was making a wish. And given the guy's concentration, it seemed to be the case. He must be wishing to return home soon. He really was different from Kim Rok-soo. He grew up in a good family, and that helped him survive this horrible situation until now. The young man calls Kale, because he had something to ask and a report to deliver. Although he had a bad feeling about it, the redhead tells him to ask the question first. Then Choi Han asks if he wasn't going to make a wish, which is pretty anticlimactic. And the MC explains that he doesn't make wishes so he doesn't build expectations. It's definitely more comfortable to live without them. For example, if you scratch a lottery ticket expecting to win 100 and end up winning 500, you feel good. But if it's the other way around, you feel like garbage. Hollins grabs his shoulder with a smile and says the master was right. There's no such thing as dreams and hope in that world. But Kim just tells him to shut up. He was already out of patience when the blonde went back to dealing with the cats. Choi Han regains his attention, revealing that what he wanted to report was that the dragon ended up entering the city. But the redhead simply asks him to pretend he didn't notice, and the young man nods. Staring out at the horizon, our boy was stressed out, realizing the creature had followed him all the way there. Wrapping up the topic, he calls his group to resume the journey. There at the temple, the little dragon watched him carefully. The next day, the protagonist decides to visit the grave of the man who lived to be 150, and he informs his subordinates that he would take only Choi Han. He knew none of them would follow if he took him, since he was the strongest. In truth, he should have gone alone, but doubted they'd allow it. Though reluctant, the vice captain simply obeys. Meanwhile, Hans volunteers to take care of the kittens as if he'd been waiting for that. During their walk, Choi Han asks what Kim was planning for the day, and he explains that people would think he causes trouble every day if they heard that. But pointing to a mountain, he says there was something to take care of there, and he wanted him to wait at the entrance. When the hero nods, the redhead reflects on how much he likes him, because he never asks for details about what he does or doesn't do. A bit further ahead, he catches the young master's attention to say he'd be leaving the next day, which Kim already knew. He was the one who had asked him to go. However, the boy reveals that he'd been thinking a lot and decided there's something he should know, and his boss knew it had nothing to do with the dragon. Without patience, the protagonist asks what that thing was. Then Choi Han states that Ron is a very dangerous man. That catches him a little off guard. He didn't think he'd come out with it like that, and he wonders whether to act like he already knew or not. He chooses the second option, but remains calm while faking surprise, which makes the hero explode, asking how he's not shocked, since the old man smells like ink, like someone who's been painting his whole life. And he confesses that he thought the noble knew from the beginning, but still kept him around. Apparently, he believed that if Kim had known that information, he would have brought Ron along when they went to rescue the dragon. But not bringing him meant either he didn't know about his strength or didn't trust him enough, which led the boy to conclude he just didn't know. He keeps ranting about the situation, saying it seemed like no one knew the old man's true strength. That's why he wanted to say it outright. So the noble pretends he doesn't know that Ron is strong. Choi-han comments that his strength felt dark and asks whether the MC would still keep him around. He just didn't know the plan was to get rid of both of them. When he says he and Ron were the same, the hero seems a little offended. But Kim recaps, "You're telling me Ron is strong, right? Then why didn't you do anything about him?" The question leaves the boy speechless. So the redhead explains that it's because the butler hadn't done anything against him. And besides, he'd been his servant for 18 years already. They never got mad at him, not even when he walked around with the vice captain like they were equals, or when he did Han's job in his place. The MC asks if his subordinate hated Ron, which wasn't the case. He just thought it'd be good for the redhead to know he was a dangerous guy, but he insists that the two were the same to him. After all, Choi-han was also very strong. By that logic, he was dangerous too. Hidden in the branches of a nearby tree, Ron had been listening to the entire conversation, even the part when Kin reaffirmed that as long as he was his servant, that's all he'd ever be, just like Choi, who was only there to repay him. Since it was almost time, the MC asks if the swordsman had anything else to say, and with silence as the answer, he says goodbye, asking him to wait right there and not follow. The butler finally climbs down from the tree and asks if the boy had heard what his boss said. The guy had changed his diapers and raised him. There was no competing with that. But all the hero says is that Kale asked him to wait there and not follow him, and the servant rudely replies that he already knows. He only came because he even left the cats at the inn. People say unexpected situations happen more often as you get older. Apparently, he came for nothing. Meanwhile, near the entrance, Kim complains. He didn't think it would be something so small that he'd have to crawl to get inside. The clothes he wore that day were going to get completely dirty. With no other option, he pushes forward. He celebrates once he manages to get inside the cave. It definitely exceeded his expectations as he looked around. The wind in there was so strong it felt like the walls might collapse at any moment, which makes him wonder if the sound of the wind will be like that once he obtains the desired power. Without Cage's help, Taylor definitely wouldn't have been able to get it. Now it was just a race against time. However, before moving forward, a little creature shouts that he can't go any farther because he's too fragile. It was the affectionate dragon, who finds it odd to see a white aura around the boy. He looks at him angrily, and the little one says he was just passing through, which was a blatant lie. He had been following him, but Kim didn't have time to worry about that right now. The strength of the three winds changes every 3 hours, and now was its weakest period. He needed to finish his task before it got strong again. As he moves forward, the little thing says he thought he was just a weak human. Apparently, that wasn't the case. The redhead was wielding his white aura with skill. The dragon asks what kind of power that was, but gets no answer. Kim was focused on the mission, and even though the wind was weak, it was getting stronger as he neared the center, but he still managed to press on. Besides, he expected the wind to push him back, so when things got harder, he planned to shrink the shield. And so he kept moving forward, fearless, until suddenly, he heard a voice saying it regretted everything, just like he heard from the tree where he obtained the shield. It wouldn't stop, the lamenting only grew more intense. A little annoyed, Kim wonders why none of the ancient beings were ever normal, and why Taylor thought the voice sounded sincere. Then the voice comments that the boy possessed a familiar power, and it hoped he wouldn't receive another. That made the boy more interested in what it had to say, and it confesses to betraying its friends, being a terrible person. As the wailing increased, the wind blew even stronger. It had been the only one left alive to grow old, which was shameful. It wished everyone could come back to life, but that was impossible, so it never finished its tower. All that talking was extremely annoying. The voice didn't sound sincere at all. It sounded like it was grieving over the fact that it actually wanted to pass on. The crying was so unbearable that Kim wished it were someone yelling at him instead. But the voice kept lamenting, saying it was garbage and the power was only good for self-defense. But the MC didn't care, since protecting oneself was all that mattered. He just needed to take 5 more steps to reach the small stone tower. On the first step, it felt like his shield might break, maybe even get sliced by the wind, so he had to shrink it a bit more. On the second step, the voice said that even when the wind split it in half, it still couldn't leave. Third step, now it said how his heart was beating, but it could move forward due to fear of death and pain. Fourth step, it revealed it was more afraid of death than anything, because it marked the end of the pain. On the fifth and final step, the wind stopped. Even so, the voice didn't. It said it had chosen to throw everything away just to stay alive, to which Kim responds that you'd have to be alive first for that to matter. Looking at the stones in front of him, the MC concludes that he didn't need to stack them in a pretty way. It was like any other stone tower. Everything was very simple when he picked up the last stone. As he placed it, a bright light burst from the tower, making the dragon, who was still there, curious. Then the voice returns. I tried to fight them, but I didn't know I was so weak against pain. They were people who didn't follow the Lord. And it continues, saying it only realized that after they had already been separated. The forest people only gave it bad food, which sounds familiar to the redhead. It stacked the stones hoping to go back in time, but only destroyed them. It hated itself even more after betraying its companions to escape. Hearing that, Kim says selfishness is a natural part of being human. Asking if it was done talking yet, he stares at the tower, annoyed. But it continues, saying that its sister had said the same thing. She was a great sister, adding that the protagonist's personality reminded it of his older brother, and it was jealous of how rude the boy was. Finally, it tells the redhead to destroy the tower because doing so would help him surpass his limits. At last, the boy smiles. That's exactly what he was waiting for. From afar, the dragon watched the human with a strange expression. Upon knocking down the tower, a glowing white orb floated in front of him. When he touched it, Kim was pierced by the aura emitted by the item. He could feel the energy flowing through his body, just like when you have a shield. That energy would strengthen his indestructible shield, which would allow him to regenerate faster than a regular person. Leaving the cave, the human glared at the little dragon with an unfriendly face. Seeing the creature standing still, he asked if it wanted to follow him or not, making it leap forward. The human was so weak he needed protection, but he hated humans. His disappearance gave the impression of a very indecisive child. So Kim continued his walk. However, upon noticing the creature's presence, he stated that he could see it in the grass. There was no way around it. He had to accept that his group had grown. As he approached Choi, the boy asked if his master had rolled down the mountain or something. He said yes, since he had no other excuse for being that dirty. That night, in the outskirts of Purcell, Katie dropped a teacup on the ground while yelling, worrying Taylor. She asked him not to talk to her right now, but the guy asked if God was talking to her again. Out of nowhere, she kicked the furniture, stressed about how annoying he was. That made the guy concerned, prompting him to ask his servant to leave. Then, he asked the girl what was wrong. The two vented to the balcony, where Cage observed several writings etched into the railing. She was surprised they were actually there. "Break it if you want your wish granted," was what it said. With her eyes closed, the woman listened as God advised her to break it, but she had no idea what he was talking about. Taylor noticed her confusion and asked her to explain. It was the first time she wasn't talking nonsense, according to her. Normally, she only heard the divine voice once a year. When Taylor asked what was so special about the stone tower, she said it would completely change their lives, at least according to God. And the decision was entirely his, but he said not to break anything if he wanted to live in peace. Looking at the tower, she noticed an envelope there, probably the reason the tower existed. Kay said she didn't feel anything dangerous coming from it and asked what she should do. Smiling, Taylor told her to break it, and so she did, without hesitation. She had never lived in peace anyway and didn't plan to. Once his legs were healed, the man planned to move forward. He would transform that damn Marcus family. Opening the envelope, he read the words. The Crown Prince possesses an ancient power. It's called the Star of Healing and is useless to him. It was a power that could be used only once to heal any injury. He wants to trade it for a way to control the second and third princes. After finishing the letter, Taylor was sure that it could change their lives. Cage snatched the letter from his hand, asking to take a look. There it was. You might not be able to move your legs, but your brain, arms, eyes, mouth, everything else is still alive. The decision was all his, Taylor Stan, the eldest son of the Marquis Stan family. He calls Cage, asking her to tell the butler to pack up because they're going to the capital, and the woman nods. He seemed to know what he was doing, which was true. He had known how to take care of himself easily before injuring his legs. From the top of the wall, the cats were watching the entire conversation between Taylor and Cage. Hong asked if they could leave now and on, excited, confirmed it. Now it was time for a nighttime snack. The next morning, the group stood in front of the hotel for Choi's farewell. Looking him up and down, the protagonist asked if he really planned to leave looking like that. And innocently, the hero confirmed. So Kim threw a small pouch toward the boy, telling him to take it. Its contents shocked him, as if he couldn't accept what was inside. It contained some useful items like healing potions, herbs, a map, and even money. Before he could say anything, the redhead got defensive, saying he could throw it away if he wanted. And with that, he turned his back. He knew it wasn't anything special, but at least it was a decent farewell gift. Smiling, the boy shouted a "see you later" to the young master. Meanwhile, the vice captain said he'd work hard to become the noble's personal guard in the capital, and Hans wished him a safe trip. Ron also said goodbye with a smile, but all Beecroc said was that he'd keep his blade sharp. The kittens said goodbye in their own way, with lots of affection. From afar, the dragon watched the moment, casting a blue aura in Chai-Han's direction before finally resting. The boy left feeling indebted to the redhead, since he had gained so much because of him. With that feeling, he finally says goodbye to everyone. At last, they left Purcell for the capital on the same day Choi-Han departed. As usual, they camped as the sun began to set. Noticing the kitten's restlessness, Kim asks what the problem is. And smiling, he suggests they might have seen a dragon or something like that. Even with the swordsman gone, he still had a dragon following him, and it wasn't like he could convince him to come. He had chosen to follow on his own. A sound in the middle of the forest where they were catches the group's attention, and the vice captain volunteers to check it out. There was another carriage, and one of the knights was asking permission to camp in the same area as the Hennetus. Kim watches from a distance as the soldier introduces himself. It was Tom, part of the Marquis Stan family. That makes him tense. He didn't know it was them with that simple carriage lacking the family's crest. They explained they saw the Hennetu symbol and decided to ask for help, even if it might be considered rude. And there he was, Taylor Stan. The MC gets stressed just thinking he had finally gotten rid of a problem and already picked up 3 more. And not just any 3, but a very clever dragon, a crazy priestess who wants to be excommunicated, and a rebel from the Marquis family. Kim sighs before saying anything, and the man is quick to say he knew it was rude to ask something so suddenly, so they'd leave immediately if they were causing discomfort. The truth is, everyone had been uncomfortable since Taylor became paraplegic, and the noble realizes it was no different with the Hennetus. However, the MC asks why they would leave. After all, that wasn't even his land. He'd never do something so childish, especially since both were just travelers. So he extends his hand to the blonde, introducing himself as Kale Hennetus. Somber, Taylor explains that it's hard for him to get out of the carriage because of his legs, but the boy says he's already aware of that. Even so, they shake hands, and the hare expresses his gratitude for meeting the boy, taking the opportunity to introduce the priestess who had remained quiet until then. She greets him with a smile, wishing that the peace of the night always be with the boy, which makes the redhead give a fake smile, knowing she was acting all sweet even though she found it annoying. It was her main reason for wanting to be excommunicated. Loud and clear, Kim says he doesn't believe in God. Time to activate the Hennetus family's trash mode. His words surprise the pair, and the woman wonders how someone could be crazy enough to say that out loud. The MC imagines that Taylor must have spent a good amount installing magical devices around his house, since his family didn't provide him with proper escorts. That means he was probably out of money now, and it looks like he's heading to the capital to meet the prince after reading his letter. In the middle of that silence, the boy asks Hans to assist the new camping companions. He should make sure their meals are prepared and that their camp is set up close to theirs, insisting they not bother him for anything. The newcomers watch the scene in disbelief at such a kind gesture. But all that charity goes out the window when Kim tells the butler to bring him some alcohol. Then he says goodbye to Taylor, who thanks him for everything. Even while pretending to be modest, the truth was the redhead just didn't want any involvement with the man in front of him. As he walks past the vice captain, he orders the officer to assist with their defense since their group only had one night. In the carriage, the cats get excited about meeting that pair, but the boy tells them to pretend they don't know anything, just like they did with the dragon. Speaking of him, On asks if the little guy was still following them. Originally, Kim only planned to rescue him, but he had been following him everywhere, even though he didn't feel the need to repay or acknowledge it. Leaving the cats waiting for an answer, he smiled at the possibility of having a dragon. It was a being capable of detecting mana much better than Rosalind. Besides, he could make the creature work hard. The next morning, the first thing the redhead sees upon waking is a commotion between Taylor, Cage, and their officer, and he immediately asks Hans what it's about. And the blonde explains that apparently the young hare misunderstood something. But Kim gets confused, approaching the guests to get a clearer understanding of the situation. Promptly, the newcomer offers a sincere apology to the protagonist. Then, upon noticing a fallen animal in front of him, he states that his movements have been detected. However, the noble knew exactly who was responsible for that. Cage screams as she wonders how that could be possible, since they had left in secret, questioning if there was someone capable of escaping her protection. The MC just stares blankly, because someone at that level would never detect a dragon. It made sense they freak out over someone catching a boar and not being noticed. Taylor keeps lamenting when the boy calls for beecrocs. And showing the defeated animal, he suggests they have meat for breakfast again, which the chef considered high-quality meat. The word again leaves the blonde in disbelief. So Kim explains that there was someone in his group who supplied them with food, and Taylor quickly questions him. The shameless one says that since they were really shy, he doubted anyone would even see them, which makes the noble sigh, apologizing for the confusion, but our boy just asked them to enjoy the delicious meat beecrocs would prepare before they resumed the trip. And he uses the moment to mention he heard that young Master Kale was headed to the capital. Cautiously, Taylor asks if they could follow in case it wouldn't be a bother, something that doesn't surprise the MC. That's why he says to do as they please. It's not like they'd find out who wrote the letter anyway, so he might as well look after them until the capital and make them owe him. Noticing the dude's excitement, Kim was sure they'd be very useful in the future. Taylor reaffirms the agreement with the caveat that they'd only travel together until the city outskirts. He was smart. He knew there would be problems if they arrived together. Even so, the protagonist says they decide that when the time came. To which the noble replies with a polite request. Please feel free to tell us when it's more convenient for you, young master. Our boy asks to have his meal in the carriage, but before he gets there, Cage steps in his path. She wanted to know if he really didn't believe in God. He didn't know why she asked that, but even so, he confirmed. And he'd never know because the girl just says she understands and walks away, heading toward Noble Stan, who quickly asks what was wrong. The girl confesses she finds everything kind of weird, revealing she has the feeling that the god of death was in her head with a friendly expression. After that, the journey went on smoothly, and there was only one day left before reaching the capital. Kim was sitting in that night's hotel room when Taylor and Cage showed up with a bottle of liquor. But he looked at the object in the boy's hands with disdain, remembering that Trash Kale couldn't go even one day without drinking. However, the blonde says that his love of drinking didn't seem to be everything about him. From what he observed, he was very different from the rumors. After all, he stayed in the carriage for most of the time out of respect for the two of them and did his best to treat them kindly. Even his servants treated them the same way. And not just that, the redhead had treated them normally, which was more valuable than anything. So with a big smile on his face, he invites the protagonist to have a few drinks before moving on. Closing the door, Kim asks what the man really wanted with all this. And just as he suspected, he wasn't trash. In fact, he was very smart. But Taylor keeps his composure, asking what kind of person the MC thought he was. Before he could answer, our boy sighs and throws a bag full of coins on the table in front of them, and says that even though he didn't know why they were heading to the capital when it would be full of nobles, he knew there was only one thing he could want: money. The redhead asks if he's wrong, but the blonde is left speechless, realizing the MC had already figured out his intentions. He explains that the way they were traveling made it clear they were out of money, and they'd need a lot if they wanted to stay hidden in the city. Smiling, Kim was sure that wasn't the original plan, but it was easy to ask when you had a golden goose traveling with you. Asking the boy for money would benefit Taylor. Even if he refused to give any, he didn't seem like the kind of person who'd tell Venyan about it, because he didn't seem to be into complicated matters like someone who chose to hide from others. The noble thanks him for the favor. They'd be leaving early the next morning and plan to enter through the temple. Upon hearing that, Kim mourns that even if they enter through there, Venyan or the Marquis himself would hear about it in 3 days. There were probably informants inside. The blonde is shocked at how well-informed the protagonist was, and Cage asks if there was a specific reason the boy was so interested in their plans. Ignoring the question, he asks them to use the money to pay for rooms reserved for his group at the hotel for one more day, and he tells the two of them to ride in his carriage, which would make his group follow a day behind. Handing over another pouch, the protagonist explains that it contains a magical tool that makes all life forms in an area invisible for 5 minutes. Taylor asks why the man is doing all of this for them if he's not getting anything in return. He had to help them because he was the one who caused all that. And with Taylor in the position of Marcus, he would help the Hennetus territory remain neutral so they could live in peace. However, all he says is that the pair is pathetic, and he wants to know what someone like the Hare, a cripple who doesn't even know when he'll kick the bucket, is doing trying to handle all this. To him, it was pathetic to see the Marquis' eldest son begging for money from the trash of the Count's family. He may have lost feeling in his legs, but his eyes, nose, mouth, and hands were still alive. Even so, Taylor thanks him for his compassion. Before the matter is closed, Kim reveals that there's a condition for all that kindness. They had to forget everything. Cage speaks up, assuring that her master and she would swear before the god of death that everything will remain secret, and she assumes he wouldn't be making a vow as well. She was right. If things got complicated, Kim intended to reveal everything to Venyan. Taylor calls the priestess's attention to begin the vow immediately. Suddenly, a purple aura covers the room, and then the woman swears with her life and her master's to keep everything secret with Kale Hennetus. Finishing, she explains that the sensation the MC felt was the power of the vow, and if they broke it, he would be informed of the consequences they'd suffer. Then the noble holds out the bottle he had brought, inviting him to drink again. For him, there was nothing better than alcohol in that weather. The priestess even had wine glasses with her, which was impressive. She asks if the young man doesn't find it strange to see a priestess drinking, but he replies that it's none of his business. The woman liked him, and she asked if the MC would like to meet an older sister with a strong personality, but that wasn't the case. Taylor redirects the question to himself, and Kim says he'd like it even less. The pair bursts into laughter, and then they start drinking. Somehow, alcohol had united those 3 individuals that night. The next day, the trio was traveling in the Hennetus carriage. They were supposed to arrive at the capital in about 2 hours. The cats were eyeing Taylor suspiciously, even though he only smiled back at the little creatures. Trying to start a conversation, the man asks if Kim knows anything about that year's royal event, and the boy reveals it's his first time at the palace. He'd only gone a few times before for a meeting of northeastern nobles a few years ago. Then the noble explains that this time's event was the celebration of the king's 50th birthday, like a festival of entertainment for the people. Unfortunately, Kim thought the idea of a festival was ridiculous, because his heart started racing just thinking about the terrorist attack. He was probably the only one who knew about it, which gave him a strong feeling of responsibility and a major headache. To him, ignoring that fact was the same as fearing death. Of course, he would try to prevent it from happening, but if it became too difficult for him, or if he had to get hurt for it, he planned to let it go. Kim asks if the event wasn't also a festival for young Master Taylor, who replies that he saw it as the last obstacle before he could truly celebrate. A bit more seriously, he advises the redhead to be careful with His Highness, the prince, revealing that although the king's 50th birthday celebration had been planned from the beginning, the idea to summon all the nobles came from the prince, and he thinks about how he could describe him. But Kim is quicker to say that he was someone good with words, which perfectly expresses what the noble was trying to say. Apparently, he was well informed, but the boy claims that kind of information is easy to get. Even so, it was the first time Taylor had seen someone as talkative as the guy in front of him. The compliment reminds him of how good the prince was at complimenting people. Because of that, he was able to use them without them even realizing it. One of his victims in the novel was Choi Han, the person the prince drew in as a close friend and hero. And someone like that boy thought it was great to be near the prince, even though he had no idea he was being used. But even if that was the case, it was all for a good cause. But the prince didn't use people for personal gain or power. He used them for the good of the kingdom, the citizens, and to make the nation a better place. When he used that skill with words to give praise, it was only natural that Choi Han and Rosalind didn't say no. Taylor brings back his focus, stating that it would be very problematic if he got involved with someone like the prince. And Kim tells him not to worry since he planned to spend his time there as quietly as possible before going home. He hated drawing attention. Noticing the blonde staring at him, our boy asks what he was looking at so much. However, when he starts to speak, he cuts himself off, rushing it off and saying it was nothing important. But Kim knew what he wanted to say. He knew he attracted attention anyway. Still, he assures him that what the pair feared would happen wouldn't, because he also had skill with words, and the prince usually kept his distance from those like him. Changing the subject, Cage compliments the redhead's appearance, saying the look matched his evil vibe, which he found better than looking like a good person, honestly. When they finally arrive in the capital, he notices how different the city was. The Rung Kingdom was the kingdom of stones. There were records about them even from before the kingdom existed. One of them mentioned a stone guardian who protected everything from any attack, and Taylor says that when darkness fell upon the continent, it stood against it. Cage comments that the young master liked that story, and he nods. Continuing, he says that the guardian stood firm like a rock even when its body was damaged. That's how it protected that land. The blonde confesses he really liked that story because an existence like that wouldn't survive in modern times, and Cage asks if he didn't believe in the legend. But it was rare to see someone get hurt to protect something, and Kim agreed. It was one thing to protect yourself, but he saw no logic in protecting others or that land. It was the first time he had heard such a specific story, and considering the novel had all kinds of mythology, nothing compared to that. Taylor suggests it's because the Guardian wasn't very popular. He himself had only discovered it while researching old text about lost powers. Realizing where they were, Kim hands a small glowing object to the boy and tells him to get ready. The carriage stops and his vice captain announces that the capital's guards wanted to inspect the vehicle's occupants. So he kicks open the door while holding a bottle of booze, which leaves the officers awkward, but that was nothing new for the vice captain. Getting off the carriage along with the cats, the boy tells them to move on. The item he gave his friends allowed them to become invisible, so the guards found absolutely nothing inside the carriage. They apologize for the intrusion, allowing the protagonist to enter once again and welcoming him to the capital. Once the doors were shut, he celebrates the successful entry with Taylor, who smiles and says it had been a long time since he felt so welcomed. The group was already in the western district of Hua City when the MC began instructing the pair on what to do upon arrival at the residence. Basically, they had to follow Ron and forget about everything else. Hans opens the door to announce that they had reached their final destination. So the redhead steps down while his companions say their farewells, grateful for all the help. Seeing his new quarters, he's impressed. It was better than expected, definitely showed how wealthy Count Henatus's family was. It might not be that luxurious or shiny, but everything looked more expensive compared to other noble properties nearby. The servants greet him as young Master Henatus, welcoming him to the estate, and stating they would do their best to serve him. He looks at Hans, who just shrugs. Everything felt kind of over the top, which made him wonder if the men there had a few screws loose. That's why he asked them to raise their heads, explaining that they didn't need to be so respectful. He wouldn't cause trouble for those who did their jobs well. His mother had hired them, and she said they were very proud of their work, so he was sure they'd do great. Finally, he tells them to speak to Hans if they have any questions. He intended to keep himself busy with other things in the meantime. Then he and the blonde walk toward the residence. The head butler comments to the other staff that it would be a bit tricky to deal with the young man, but they had to treat him well since he was part of the family. Meanwhile, Kim was pouting at an envelope left on the table, and Hans asks if he wasn't going to accept the invitation. That confuses him. He didn't know he could go, and the blonde explains that he actually couldn't because it was a gathering of northeastern nobles. And he hands over the list of nobles currently in the capital for the redhead to take a look at, assuring him that Ron had taken care of everything. He dismisses the butler, asking him to bring something to eat before going to rest. Alone in the room, Kim seems pensive. However, when he opens the balcony windows, he allows a very special guest to come in and eat with him. It was the little dragon who stared at the food in front of him while being encouraged to eat properly. He needed to eat well alongside the cats, since they'd all be working hard in the future. That was great. The boy was in a big house with good food and a peaceful environment, and being able to enjoy all three at once was very nice. Now that was living. But his peace is shattered by a loud bang at the door, causing him to drop his glass on the carpet. He knew it couldn't be Choi Han, since he was supposed to arrive in 3 more days, unless he came rushing in like a lunatic. but he'd probably be accompanied by a wounded Locke, and the potions Kim had given him didn't work on the wolf tribe, and not even Rosalind could use magic for that. On top of that, he had told Choi Han to stay at a specific hotel once he arrived in the capital. However, when he opens the door, the protagonist's expression becomes a mix of surprise and dread. It really was Choi Han, carrying a man on his back and apologizing for coming to him, but saying he was the only person he could think of. Outside, Rosalind watches the situation seriously. Kim asks him to bring the child into the room. It was indeed Locke from the Blue Wolf tribe, and he didn't look well at all. The symptoms suggested he was close to having his first berserk transformation, though that shouldn't happen until next year, which leaves the boy confused. The child saw himself lost in the forest, calling for his uncle. It was like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Observing the scene, Choi Han asks the protagonist what was going on and explains that neither the potion nor healing magic work on the wolf tribe. Desperate, he says he should have protected the boy, but Kim tells him to calm down, fearing that if he kept going, he might accidentally awaken him. That's why he asks him to let him handle it if he truly trusts him, which fortunately he does. Even so, the MC wondered what had happened. He knew the hero was a good guy and easy to connect with. But in the novel, he had only started to open up to Locke around this point and wasn't this close to him yet. It could be another result of our boy's interference in the story. Meanwhile, Rosalind, the first successor to the throne of Breck, watched everything calmly, and to think this genius mage was going to throw everything away. Sensing the mana aura in the room, she's surprised by its strength. It was the little dragon waving while emanating his own magic. Dragons were always interested in mages. It seemed he was showing off to the girl after noticing her presence. Kim tells him to be quiet, making the little one sulk. As he withdraws, Rosalind screams in frustration, but the boy is firm in reminding her that the unconscious kid was the priority. She asks what exactly was happening with Locke, which surprises him, since he didn't expect her to use advanced magic, given how cautious she was. Apparently, the reason they arrived so quickly was her teleportation magic. Contrary to his expectations, the mage had already shown the extent of her abilities. The boy confirms she was indeed a sorceress before asking if she had ever heard of the berserk mode of the beast tribes. And she explained she'd read about it in a few books, but none mentioned such high fever or the level of bodily pain the boy was expressing. However, Kim explains that he was feeling all that because it was his first time, which makes the girl widen her eyes. Then he says that beast people lose their sanity the first time due to the pain they experience, but if they can endure it, they can use berserk mode as a weapon. Realizing that was the boy's case, Rosalind says she's able to understand the whole situation now. After all, he was just a young boy, a fact that could even sadden the redhead's hardened heart. Hans quickly arrives with the drinks he was asked to bring, and his master asks him to bring something to carry the child and take him to the underground training arena, making sure no one else is there. Even without understanding why they'd take someone suffering to a training arena, the blonde nods. Pretending not to know Rosalind's name so that she'll introduce herself, Kim calls the mage and Choi Han. But when he says the two of them would need to get beaten up a little, the pair is left confused. Basically, when Beastkin went into berserk mode for the first time, their parents and siblings helped take care of them. They would take all the attacks from the individual to make sure they didn't get hurt, protecting their children. But since that wouldn't happen with Locke, the two of them would have to act as father and mother or older siblings if they preferred to see it that way. In short, Kim explains that they'd have to protect him. In the underground arena, the little boy was still lying on the ground when Choi Han asked the young master how long berserk mode lasted, and the boy replies that the kid had the purest blood of all, which meant it would take a while, between 1 and 2 hours. Even so, the hero was determined to endure as long as needed, since he was Locke's older brother. Cutting the idle talk, the redhead tells the pair to head to the center, near the wolf. He finally wakes from the trance, howling loudly, though still on the ground. Suddenly, his nails turn into sharp claws and his eyes darken with red pupils, and his teeth were now as sharp as blades, enhancing his beastly appearance. Watching the sudden changes, Choi Han and Rosalind remain frozen. Meanwhile, outside the arena, the dragon cast a mana barrier to protect the cats and Kim, justifying it by saying the boy was too weak and needed protection. Annoyed by the little wolf's growls, he asks if they could make a soundproof barrier too, leaving the beast with a dumbfounded look. His abilities were evolving quickly, which was a sign he'd be very useful in the future. After a while, the redhead sits on the ground to wait for the fight to end, and asks if An and Hong had already gone through their berserk transformations. They deny it, and didn't know anything about the process either, since they never had anyone to teach them. Kim figured that was the case. The two seemed like purebloods, which meant their transformations would be difficult too. The wolf, tiger, bear, and whale tribes were the ones who lost rationality the most during the process, so they were closer to being monsters. He says he didn't know how it worked in the cat tribe, but if they felt it coming on, they should find him immediately. Their eyes shine, feeling loved and cared for by the MC, who wanted to take precautions before any accidents happened. Overly affectionate, the two little creatures rub against him, which irritates him. In the arena, Locke's transformation continued, but Kim couldn't stop wondering why that wolf kid began transforming out of nowhere. In the novel, he was only supposed to worry about this a year later, and the reason would be the arrival of someone else. More specifically, the healer Pendrick, someone who would remind the boy of his late uncle. That would drive Locke insane, sparking a wild urge to destroy everyone around him. At this point, the boy already had a tail and ears, and his physique was larger than normal. His new older siblings were shouting at him to wake up, but it was useless. His eyes look even more furious. Then, without holding back, the wolf lunges toward Choi, who uses the hilt of his sword to stop the bite, pleading for him to snap out of it. But Locke was out of his mind, snatching the weapon from the boy's hands and throwing it far away. From a distance, Kim thought the guy was pathetic for believing that plea would help in any way, suggesting that a hit to the head would have been faster and more effective. He calls the cat's attention, asking them to watch how the wolf boy was moving, because those were instinctual movements of a beastkin, and the fact that they could move by instinct, unlike humans, was one of the most beautiful aspects of those tribes. So he tells them not to fear the transformation because that's when their beastly powers were most visible, but to observe Locke's movements closely. They should use their instincts or think of some way to take down all the wild beasts. Back to the fight, the boy continues chasing the swordsman. When it seems he'll finally strike, Rosalind projects a magic shield in front of him. From behind it, she yells at Locke to remember her, and how she told him she was part of his family. Seeing the boy's persistence, Choi Han shouts at him to attack while he runs away from the mage. And the little wolf looks possessed as he sees his prey getting away. The dragon points out to Kim how Rosalind and Choi Han were using their skills not to attack, but to defend themselves without hurting Locke, saying it was much harder not to injure someone than it was to injure them. But all the redhead says is that since he was a dragon, he learned quickly. Tired, he says that being a dragon, there was nothing he couldn't do. Something the boy agrees with, asking her to pay close attention to the three fighters and draw her own conclusions. It really seemed like Locke would just get exhausted in 2 hours, causing enormous regret in the MC for not bringing a bottle of wine. The battle continues with the same dynamic. No attacking, only defense. At this point, the boy was gasping from exhaustion. Even panting, he called out for his new brothers, returning to his human form. "I'm sorry" are the only words he manages to say before collapsing to the ground, caught by Choi, who was deeply worried about his brother's condition. When Kim appears in his blurry vision, he calls him uncle, but the redhead quickly puts him down to rest, because it was finally over. The hero lays the boy's body on a mat and Rosalind just watches. However, Kim catches her attention by handing her a potion, to which the woman replies that potions don't work on Locke. With his usual humor, the MC asks why he would give a potion to someone from the wolf tribe, stating that it was for the lady. Staring at him in disbelief, the redhead thanks him for the thought, but the noble says it was nothing much. Then he turns to Choi, because they need to talk. He lets the servants take care of the boy, who is still unconscious, before heading to the room with the young man. Kim asks him to explain everything, and the hero starts by saying that everything was fine until he met Rosalind. He had met up with a merchant guild he had mentioned. Actually, it was more of a brigade of 5 people than a guild, but that didn't matter. When he met them, he found out they were in need of 2 mercenaries to protect them, since their guards were always getting injured. Then, he met the mage, and she was exactly as the redhead had described her. The kingdom of Breck was beyond the northwest border of the Roan kingdom, and the woman was heading to the magical tower in the Whipper kingdom, traveling through Roan, when an assassination attempt prevented her from continuing. Kim thinks that even if she managed to escape, there was no way of knowing who was pursuing her, which is why he thought it best for her to come to the capital before Roan found anything out. Resuming his explanation, Choi Han says that since the two of them had a common destination, they became friends, something the noble finds quite strange. He admits he wasn't someone good at starting conversations, but believed they could become friends, and Kim tells him he didn't need to do that, saying he just needed to act like himself. Originally, the two wouldn't get close until they met Locke. In the novel, Rosalind became cautious of others after the attempt and didn't want to be friendly with anyone, and Choi Han went down a similar path after the village incident. Even so, there he was, saying he wanted to do things the right way, since it was his way of giving back. That group planned to stay in the village the young master had mentioned, and they continued the journey after a few days of rest, but something stopped them when they reached the village. The hero reveals he discovered that their injured guard was a beast person. He remembered a massive box the men were carrying. According to them, it wasn't any merchandise or anything like that, but they intended to trade with someone who lived in the mountain village. Upon hearing that, his thoughts were consumed by the possibility of meeting Locke if he followed them. The next afternoon, the merchants were anxiously waiting for their buyer, who was running late. So they asked Choi Han to help carry the package to the village since they were getting worried about the delay. That reminded him of Kim's words, "Go to the village with the guard." So he accepted the request. However, when they got there, they came upon a horrible scene. The place was engulfed in flames, including the buyers of the merchandise. With a trembling voice, the hero calls out to Kim, saying he had seen something he was already too used to seeing. A white star with 5 red stars. That information seems to catch the protagonist off guard this time, since he didn't know the organization would be there. According to the novel, Choi Han would arrive at the Wolf Tribe's village while it was burning, but that would have been the act of criminals, not the organization. He asks if everyone had been knocked out, and the young man denies it, explaining that they seem to be taking the younger ones and killing the rest. It was really strange. In the original story, they wiped out the population. Why did they try to capture them now? Back to the retelling, the swordsman says that's when Locke appeared. He swore that elimination and kidnapping were different. Originally, he would have stayed hidden while the other children were taken out. Watching the extermination of his family and friends must have triggered his instincts, and if that wasn't the case, then what the hell did? It was completely different from the novel, which probably wasn't a good sign. Continuing, Choi Han states that he had tried to destroy the uniformed men, because he realized that the people without stars on their clothes were the same ones who had attacked his village due to the same dark magic they used. Kim asked questions about the incident as if he were hearing about it for the first time. And the hero says that there was only one person with a white star surrounded by 5 red stars on their chest, which left him stunned. It was her who had killed the guard, a piece of shit human who drained every drop of broth from the wolf tribe people. The protagonist is thoughtful about that piece of information. So there was a crazy mage who thought he was a vampire in the story. The terrorist attack would happen in the capital, and one person would lead it, Count Dracula from Tabahe, one of the leaders of the organization addicted to people juice. That lunatic made his first appearance there in the Blue Wolf tribe, not in the capital. But why try to kidnap the children instead of eliminating them like in the novel? Such thoughts made Kim wonder if something had drastically changed after he saved the dragon, while Choi Han lamented not being able to capture him, or worse. Since the people would only commit suicide if captured, the rest were taken away by one of the men using teleportation magic, and the hero recalled something the man had said. How disappointing, they were perfect as seeds. These young ones must have even tastier juice, was what he said with a maniacal look. But the redhead was only getting more confused. What did he mean by seeds? Besides that, the swordsman reveals that Rosalind used her own magic to take the children to a tavern, along with the people who had traveled with the duo. Kim thought that he could have just left the kids at the guild with the merchants, but he couldn't comment on that while pretending not to know. The whole situation was getting on his nerves. He wanted a peaceful life, and now it felt like he was going to end up with a whole zoo in his hands. He asks if the hero was curious, which he was. There was no need to ask about what, since they had no answers to anything. Who were those people, and why were they doing that? And of course, why did he, Kale Henatus, know about their existence? The kid was definitely curious about all of it. So Kim says he's going to tell them 2 things, and the hero asks if he wasn't going to tell him everything, getting a nod in response. The MC asks the boy to stand up and reveals that they would go together to the temple of the god of death. Once there, it was time for the redhead to spill the beans. He makes a point to let the hero know that this could put his own life at risk. He asks him to follow, which makes the boy gulp nervously. The two are greeted by 2 temple guardians, who salute them religiously, wishing them to rest in peace. Kim greets the priests, asking if there was an empty room he could use. Their expression is priceless. They were worried about Choi, who looked like he was struggling and could be easily tricked. But they simply ask which one of the 2 would be risking their life, and the protagonist says it would be him. That surprises the swordsman, who calls his attention, and whispers that he'll believe him even if he doesn't do it, but the young master fires back, saying he definitely wouldn't believe it. It wasn't something that crossed his mind because he wouldn't tell anything about the secret organization, since that would only get him deeper into that mess. In the end, Choi Han would be the one to fight alongside the whales against the mermaids in the future, not to mention getting involved with all kinds of people and problems. He couldn't afford to get involved. Finally, the priests grant access to the room, explaining that they would head down to the basement to finish the preparations quickly. The dude follows them, stopping at the bottom of the stairs to wait for them to prepare the room. In front of the huge door, Kim speaks. If you really think we don't need to do this, then why don't I just tell you the truth right now? The hero asks him to do it, saying he'll believe whenever the redhead tells him. So the first truth the MC drops is kind of anticlimactic. He didn't know anything about the secret organization's identity or goals, leaving the boy speechless. But before he could say anything, one of the priests calls them and asks that the one who will risk his life stand before the priest in the room and raise his hand. Seeing Choi's look, Kim says he understands that this is hard to believe, but quickly invites him in, which he does without hesitation. Sitting in front of the priest, Kim raises his hand to take the oath. The old man points to 2 papers in front of the pair, and Choi Han quickly grabs one to read. On it, the text continues, "To the one who is putting their life at risk, the hand of the god of death will touch the one who came with you. As soon as that happens, say your oath. If you break it, destruction will fall upon you." Upon finishing the reading, Kim can only think about how twisted the manual was. Then, the priest raises his hands, channeling the aura of the god of death. The power envelops the companions, and the hero makes sure that what he's seeing is truly the power of the god before him. Staring at the extended hand, the MC contemplates the very real possibility of dying if he were to break the oath. He explains to the boy that the priest standing before him ensures that the divine won't hear, and if that's not true, he'll pay the price with his life. On top of that, he swears to speak only of losses to Choi Han in front of the god of eternal rest. If what he says ends up being a lie in any way, he will immediately rest in that place to pay the price. At the end of the promise, he wonders if he should tell everything to the swordsman, since it was something that really troubled him. He considered saying he was just a normal Korean transported into the world of a novel, or that the continent would go to war and he changed the story in his favor. Either way, it would complicate things. He had already accepted that his fate was to fall on the battlefield during the war or be eliminated by Choi Han. When he finally begins to speak, he repeats that he doesn't know the identity of the organization, which was true. After all, he'd only read up to volume 5 of the novel, so while he knew what they had done, he never found out their identities or goals. Besides, he states he hated the organization and wanted it to disappear. The hero pushes back, saying he didn't understand how he could hate people without even knowing who they were. But he explains that he knew about some of the terrible things they were planning, like the Black Dragon and Locke. Firmly, the MC says he lived his life like trash, and that this was his dream. He didn't want to become the successor of his family. He hoped his brother would take the role. Even though his father sent him there, he could have refused. So he asks why he would go to the capital as the representative of House Henetus. Noticing that Choi Han had no clue, he reveals that he went because he knew the secret organization was planning something in the capital, which surprises the boy. Of course, he couldn't say how he knew that, but since they planned to wipe out countless people, he couldn't send Basin there and expect him to stop the attack. He also hadn't planned to risk his own life, but says that after handling those problems in secret, he would return to his territory. Even with all that information, the swordsman still looked disappointed, not knowing where the young master got his intel from. To make up for it, he decides to tell one last truth. He had no intention of hurting him at all. That makes Choi Han thoughtful, but he believed the protagonist, who smiled upon hearing his words of trust. However, the boy asked him to say one more thing so he can trust him completely. It was unexpected, though he figured it wouldn't be a big deal, since he'd just have to twist the words in his favor. Since he couldn't refuse, he tells him to go ahead. Then Choi Han says he must take revenge on the organization. For the first time in his life, he confesses to having felt immense hatred towards someone. That's why he asks, pleased, tell him if he ever finds out the identity of the criminals. Kim assures him that he will, relieved because he thought he'd asked for something way harder. No need to worry, he wouldn't find out the organization's identity before Choi. And so he promises out loud that he would tell him as soon as he found out, and would pay with his life if he broke the oath. He confirms they were done with the matters at hand, and the hero nods. To close the session, the redhead places his hand on the table. The priest wishes that his life may continue for the time it was meant to before it ends, which sounded kind of ruthless, but the MC simply thanks him. Already inside the carriage, Kim decides to reveal one more thing. That crazy mage he saw in the mountain village will be the one leading the attack on the capital. Choi Han asks if he can kill that bastard if he finds him, and the young master just says he should do whatever he feels is right. Then it was settled. If their paths crossed again, it would be the end. Back in his quarters, the boy hears a knock at the door and tells the person to come in. It was Ron, holding a cup of tea, as usual. Kim asks if it's lemon tea to drink before bed, and the old man agrees. He drinks it, even knowing he wasn't used to having that at this hour. The butler asks if he can make a request of the young master, which immediately makes him choke. How could that shitty man have a request for him when he'd made it clear he thought he was useless? Even so, he asks what it is. Smiling, Ron asks for 2 days off, which surprises the protagonist a little. So he says it's a great idea. He had spent years working hard to take care of him. It was only fair that he take as many days off as he wanted. However, the truth was that he wanted him to take a really long vacation so they could be apart, but since he had to be with Choi Han during the attack, 2 days were fine. Even so, he couldn't contain his joy at knowing he wouldn't have to see that psychopath's face for the next 2 days. He asks the butler to wait a moment while he searches through his belongings, and hands him a small pouch of coins, saying it wasn't much, but enough to buy some delicious food and enjoy the break a little. Holding that money, Ron stared at him with a dumbfounded look. He had to live in hiding while taking care of that piece of trash person like a puppet, and now he could return to the world as if nothing had happened. If those people crossed over to the west, it would be worse than chaos. If that happened, he'd probably have to abandon his own son there too. But the man snaps out of his thoughts and smiles, making sure everything was really okay. He had been planning to leave in a few days without saying anything, alone or with Beecrocs, but he wanted to know Kim's reaction to his request. Apparently, he must have known what kind of person Rom was after hearing Choi Han talk. Still smiling awkwardly, he asked what he would do if he decided to run away with all that money, suggesting that the boy actually wanted him to flee. But Kim says he knew his personality. He knew that if he were going to run away, he'd do it without saying a word or would just say he was leaving. At least that's how Ron left in the novel. He didn't say anything to the Count, and whenever he had to split from Choi's group, he was always upfront about it before leaving. The old man agrees with the boy's statement. Just like he had lived with him all this time, the same applied in reverse. He assures him that he'll return to serve him when they go to the royal palace, but Kim says it's up to him. Ron knew he couldn't let him walk into the palace looking worse than the other nobles, so he says goodbye to the boy with that promise. He wouldn't let others underestimate the puppet he raised. The next morning, Kim kept the same grumpy expression as he allowed someone in who had woken him up with knocking. It was Hans, smiling as always and holding a cup, chattering about how Ron had demanded that he take care of the boy in his absence. But the redhead wasn't the least bit interested and tells him to shut up already. Handing over the cup, he says the old man was the one who asked him to bring it to the boy, who only sulks even more. As always, the MC drinks the lemonade even though it annoyed him. Meanwhile, Choi Han watches the interaction like a statue by the door. He remembers the conversation he had the night before with the old man, who answered rudely when asked where he was going. So he asks if he only came to him because of Kale, which makes Ron smile. But all he does is keep walking, telling the boy to think whatever he wanted. Noticing the hero's presence, Kim asks if Locke was awake, and he nods. The wolf tribe really did have accelerated regenerative abilities. If everything went well, the bastard son of the leader of the merchant guild, Flynn, his little piglet, Billows, would arrive in the capital soon. The boy crosses his arms, remembering that he promised to have a drink with him to return what he had borrowed. And there, the kid would meet Choi Han. Setting that aside, the MC asks how the hidden kids were doing, and the hero says he was thinking of stopping by to see them after his meeting. But Kim didn't remember any meeting. Then Hans reminds him of the invitation from the Northeastern nobles, which he had actually forgotten, even though they were important. On top of that, the butler comments that one of the guests there wanted to see him if possible. It was Rosalind, which wasn't surprising to the redhead. She was indeed a very clever young lady. Even though she had never seen a dragon, she would suspect that the mana she felt yesterday could only belong to one. Hans passes along the redhead's message to find any free time in his schedule so they could talk. So the young man asks him to prepare breakfast in his room and see if she'd like to join him. Discreetly, the blonde comments that since it was the middle of the day, he thought lunch would be more appropriate for the occasion. The redhead didn't even need to say anything for his servant to understand he wasn't in the mood for jokes and quickly went to prepare the meal. Before leaving the room, he asked him to open the terrace door. On one of the tree branches nearby, the little dragon was resting, and our boy knew he'd have to go in at some point, but he still found it strange that it was sleeping outside and so close by. Choi Han says goodbye to go see Locke while the boy eats lunch with Rosalind, since the two were alternating shifts with the help of An and Hong. On comments that she thought she and her brother were way too weak to take down someone from the wolf tribe, even if they entered berserker mode. Apparently, the duo's new goal was to find a way to fight people like Locke, so they were going to study hard. They were definitely Kim's cats, taking advantage of the situation to learn how to fight future enemies, even if the boy didn't know it. Choi Han says he didn't tell the new guests that he only brought the animals because the MC asked him to. He was great at keeping secrets. His comment makes the protagonist conclude that he was acting this way because of the oath from the previous day, but he didn't know that words could deceive, even to favor one person over others. The god would only follow the words and interpretation because Kim was the one who risked his life for it. Changing the subject, the boy asks if he really would kill the crazy mage if he saw him again, and since Choi Han didn't hesitate to agree, he was going to say how to find him. However, before he could get excited, the young master explains that he would only do that after they stopped the terrorist attack. Their conversation is interrupted by Hans, who was bringing Rosalind with him. As soon as she entered the room, the hero said goodbye, promising he'd stay with Locke. Now alone with Kim, she thanks him for the invitation and he invites her to sit. She barely gets seated when he says they had things to discuss, since he hated wasting time. Then he tells the dragon to come in through the terrace door. Noticing the disguised creature, Rosalind is surprised by its presence, and Kim asks him to fully reveal himself. The little one slowly appears on top of the table, and both he and the woman seem equally curious. But the first thing he says is, "I'm hungry," and the redhead lets him eat. Turning to the guest, he suggests the two of them should eat too. There, sitting at the table, she was freaking out inside at the sight of the creature eating next to her. She was sure no one in the magic tower would believe this if she told them, and she comments to the boy how amazing it was for a mage like her to witness something like this, a dragon and a human together, which makes the little dragon say that humans were weak with the strength of trash. That's why he was there with the boy, who quickly agrees. Still, she felt honored to have lunch with the two of them. She was a very brave person because anyone else in her place would be trembling non-stop and worshipping the creature. Then they would ask the dragon to teach something about magic or mana, even knowing that dragon magic would drive any mage on the continent insane. Kindly, the protagonist tells the girl to stay as long as she wants. Cautiously, she says she's curious about 3 things. Well, actually 2, since she already learned one of them but wasn't sure if she could ask. The boy tells her to go ahead. First, she asks if it was really okay to let someone who wasn't invited stay at his residence, since she knew very well what it meant to associate with strangers. But it was fine since the girl came with Choi Han and he had the little dragon just in case. Understanding, she moves on to the 3rd question. Why do you speak so respectfully to me even though you're a noble? That makes the boy comment on her traits and famous name, asking if it was the princess who should be treating him with less respect. Still, Rosalind ignores the fact that he knows her true identity when she says she heard he was trash, but thought that was a lie. However, he smiles, explaining that he really did have a reputation for being trash, but a mage could make her own judgments using her 5 senses. She was a very clever woman. She spoke informally with him like a princess, but when referring to herself as part of the mage society, her tone shifted. Apparently, her identity as a mage seemed very important. Kim teases her by calling her Your Highness, quickly corrected by Rosalind. Correcting himself, the redhead asks if there's anything else she wants to know, which she denies, but she comments that she thought he didn't want to get involved with her. Even being a princess, she didn't find it disrespectful when the boy told her to stay as long as she wanted. She would have revealed her identity sooner if that was what she wanted. The boy explains that he only acted that way because it seemed like that was what your highness would prefer. But she wasn't fooling anyone with that. It was just a good excuse for the princess. A human traveling with a dragon being known as trash when he wasn't anything like that. He could have easily revealed his identity there in the kingdom if he wanted to. That's what the girl thought. Still, she thanks the guy for not informing the roan royalty. And he replies that something like that should be based on one's personal interests. But the truth is that he didn't tell them because he didn't want to be attacked by the prince. Rosalind nods, saying that if not wanting to reveal himself causes any trouble in the future, he could just tell anyone that she was the one who gave the order. Once again, she thanks him for letting her stay in the residence, promising that she'd take care of her stuff and wouldn't cause any more problems, which Kim appreciates, even if it was the bare minimum. When the poor girl tries to grab a piece of meat, she gets smacked by the dragon's paw. Grumpy, he tells the girl to eat her own because that plate was all his. The two lock eyes for a moment. Before she can say anything, Kim explains that the creature was only 4 years old. So she takes on an even friendlier tone to agree with the creature's selfish behavior. With the tension gone, the three continue their meal peacefully. Later, inside the carriage, Choi-Han says that if there's anything he could do to help the young master, he just had to say it. But Kim says there's no need for him to know. The northeastern nobles would see Kale's trashy behavior in the past and the news about his shady actions in the Hennetu's territory, so he had to be careful. In fact, he'd have to be even more chaotic, but he wondered what exactly he should do to really look like trash. At Count Wheelsman's residence, the young master is received by the noble's butler. The count wasn't really rich or powerful or even influential. That's why he had such a close relationship with his father. And he liked the friendship because for someone like him whose territory was isolated in the northeast, knowing someone close to the capital was very beneficial. Kim remembered Han's instructions about keeping a good relationship with young Master Eric, staying distant during meetings and in front of other nobles. Even if Kale and Eric were close, the nobles' intel reports showed the guy was way more of a joker. The butler offers to escort the guest inside the mansion, and the boy accepts. He was nervous since he wasn't quite sure how to act when meeting his new old friend. But in the end, he didn't even need to worry about it. He was already sitting at a table with 3 young guys, including a nerd who looked like a teenager hitting puberty. They wouldn't shut up about how there was nothing wrong with finding formalities boring or annoying, so he should just chill while they take care of everything. After all, he already hated all that formality crap. Hearing all that, our boy is left speechless, with that same deadpan face as always. The nerd says he didn't need to say or do anything, just relax while they handled it all. It was kind of ironic, but Kim says he's really good at relaxing, which Eric, the 4-eyed guy, agrees with. He was known for being proper, but he was also the kind of person who worried about everything. He rambles on about poor Northeasterners, who might try to cause trouble for the MC, plus allies of Marquis Stan, but they were ready to hold the line. Out of the 10 pillar families, the Hennetu's family was one of the 4 that hadn't joined any faction. And the other nobles who allied with high-ranking nobles from outside the area would want to drag the whole Northeastern noble group into their succession plans. That's the only reason Eric and his group were being extra cautious. Those 4 families would be the main focus. That's why his family, the most powerful in the region, couldn't afford any accidents. Even thinking all that, all Kim says is that it sounded good. On top of that, Eric reveals that the group had been planning to greet the crown prince together. Seeing the redhead's nervous hand gripping the wine glass, the noble quickly explains that he'd only have to do the initial greeting. Agreeing, he raises his glass for everyone to toast. He says it's a great deal and reminds him that after the greeting, all he'd have to do was sit back and relax. Honestly, it was a really good offer. Exactly what our boy wanted. As they chill, they talk about the strong flavor of Hennetus wine. Now, everything was decided. Back in his room, Kim asks Choi-Han to come see him. He asks how the refugees' lodgings were, and the hero says the kids were super energetic, which was a good sign. Hearing that, Kim makes sure the servant had nothing else to do at the moment, and he confirms it. Then he says goodbye, asking him to tell Hans to rest and leave his guard post at the door. He wanted to know, and Choi-Han had already understood. He had left the terrace open like before, so he asked the hero to come to his room later. The boy asks if it would be just the 2 of them, without the cats. But the dragon speaks up, saying he would go with them. It would be the 3 of them. Downcast, the swordsman asks if they were going to destroy things, but the boy quickly explains that wasn't the case, and sends him off, asking him to come back soon wearing a hat. He found it strange how the servant's thoughts were always so extreme. Then he leaves the room. Seeing Kim lying on the bed, the dragon reminds him he couldn't really go to sleep, which makes him wonder if he looked like a 4-year-old to him. The boy sits on the bed, waiting for Choi, who soon appears on the balcony. Noticing the hero's look, he comments that his cape looked way better on him than a hat like the one he was wearing. And since he wasn't wearing any disguise at all, the dark-haired boy asks if he was really going like that, but the MC says he'll be invisible. Turning to the dragon, the hero suggests he shift into human form, since it should be more comfortable. But the little creature hated humans, and the last thing he wanted was to be like them. And someone had already told him dragons were cool and awesome, which makes Choi-Han curious about who said that. Kim speaks up, reaffirming that dragons are cool, and the servant agrees. Suddenly, the little one starts to emit a mana aura. While the friends are distracted on the balcony, Choi Han asks if he's going to have to carry him. But raising one of his fingers, the protagonist levitates into the air inside a red mana bubble, reaffirming dragons really are amazing. And the creature was far from modest. He knew how talented he was. At this point, even Choi Han was convinced this was a universal truth. When the trio escapes through the balcony, the boy makes sure everything is fine. Then the dragon helps the noble descend from the balcony. His abilities were much stronger than the boy had thought, on a level higher than high-ranking mages. It didn't surprise him that people said a full-grown dragon could easily destroy an entire kingdom if it wanted to. But he wouldn't need help once he obtained the Sound of the Wind, then he wouldn't have to carry the duo around with him. The Sound of the Wind was the third power our boy wanted. For that, he'd go to Lady Emerald's territory on the coast of the Rhone Kingdom. But he planned to obtain it when he returned home from the capital. He was a bit worried since it was a place near the ocean, but he could get what he wanted quietly. Besides, the whale and mermaid tribes wouldn't appear until the end of volume 4 of the novel, so he planned to say he wanted to see the scenery on the way back. Finally, he exits his train of thought to lead the way for his companions. Discreetly, they move through the city, and Choi Han notices how the nightlife there was different from other places. As they reach the more central area, the hero stares at a couple with their daughter in front of a fountain, and Kim asks the dragon to make sure no one could hear them before saying anything. Inside the sound barrier, he explains to the swordsman that there was something called a magic bomb. The name of the item alone grabs his attention, but the boy continues explaining that it could come in many forms. Since the continent had a history of wars caused by magic, it had advanced a lot. However, he warns that there are many restrictions like the bomb's location and the control of mana flow through it, which made it complicated to use. Still, those developed bombs would be used right there in multiple places exactly 6 days from now. In the novel, the hero and Rosalind discovered 5 of the bombs, but with the change in history, the MC believed the locations and people affected would be different. If that were the case, there was a high chance the attack itself had changed. But he was certain the magic bomb terrorist attack would still happen as described since he had confirmed the crazy mage was in that kingdom. Back inside the barrier, Choi Han confirms he heard it right and that the boy really said a bomb will explode there, and he nods, adding that it could be buried anywhere or installed on some person. And since that person wouldn't know they were carrying the item and would be walking around with it, they had to stop them before it was too late. For that, someone with high mana sensitivity would have to inspect the area and look for places with an abundance of mana. Choi Han asks if the mana levels of the bomb were so high they could be easily detected, but that wasn't the case. In reality, they were just slightly above normal, making it hard for average mages to notice, but they could still draw mana from the surroundings to explode. When the hero starts a bold speech about how he knew it wouldn't be easy but would try anyway, he gets cut off by Kim, who stares at the dragon. The little creature would do it in the blink of an eye and says it was definitely possible, but it was going to be a pain in the ass. Either way, with the black dragon of strong magic, they were armed with the best tool for magical sensitivity, which would make finding the items way easier. The protagonist says he didn't know about the people, but the bombs on the ground would be installed 2 days before the attack, and he hands the map to Choi. He also says that at least one bomb would be close to the plaza, since that's where the most people would be. It made perfect sense, and the hero agreed. Then Kim orders him and the dragon to walk around the city every night looking for magical bombs. The guy widens his eyes, asking if it would really be just the two of them. Getting a yes as an answer, since the redhead knew he could move around unnoticed because he was that skilled. And once they found them all, they should leave them where they were to deal with them on the day of the attack. The decision to not just destroy them confused Choi Han. Smirking, the protagonist asks if the servant didn't want to see that crazy mage again, justifying it by saying only he could remove the activation restriction. First, they had to find the bombs, and if lucky enough to catch someone installing them, they should follow without being spotted. Though it was really hard to run into people. It'd be a hell of a job looking for places with a slightly above average mana level to find the bombs. Tough and exhausting. That's why Kim dumped the task on the two of them. He wouldn't be much help anyway. And honestly, he didn't want to help. When Choi Han asks if they only had to wander around 2 days before the event, the MC says they also had to go the day before the event too. That surprises the hero, since it'd be much harder with the number of guards around. Suddenly, Kim remembers something super useful, an orb that would stop anything magic-related from working for a set amount of time. Sure, it'd only be 10 minutes, but that was more than enough. The tool would make it so the bombs didn't explode in that time frame. The duo would just have to capture the people installing them and they'd be clearly visible. And when the time came, there'd be plenty of humans and beastkin working alongside Choi Han and the dragon. Nervous, the hero vents about how hard it would be to do it all alone. But the MC cuts him off, saying that's exactly why he needed to get to work. Pointing to a bar, he says he'd be waiting there until 11 before they came back. Choi Han couldn't understand that insistence on not going with him and the little creature. Crossing his arms, the redhead complains about the cold before the hero says goodbye, asking for a beer later as compensation for the hard work. Taking the opportunity, he thanks the dragon for the help. And off they go, even with a big slice of awkward tension served at the table. After 2 days of searching, they had found absolutely nothing. And that was Kim's first thought every morning. One of the servants knocks on his door to see if he's awake. But upon seeing who it is, the boy is caught off guard. It's Ron announcing his return with a smile and handing over a letter that had arrived for the young master. The contents made the boy smile. It was Billows asking when he'd be taken out for a drink. So the redhead asked the old man to pack a bottle of his best wine. Apparently, the bastard would arrive soon in the capital, which meant it wouldn't be long until he'd meet the prince at the palace. Ron takes the chance to remind the young master that his presence had been requested at the palace in 2 days. Of course, before the king announced the start of the festival at the plaza, the nobles were supposed to meet with the crown prince for something less formal than a banquet. Still, it was scheduled to happen in the palace wing where important meetings were usually held. The mention makes the MC think of Taylor and Cage. But they were just a discarded firstborn and a crazy priestess. He was sure they'd be fine in the end. Noticing his worry, his expression changes. He shouldn't be thinking about those two. He didn't plan on doing anything at the palace, just sitting and doing nothing, even if someone cursed at him to his face, pulling him out of his thoughts. Ron calls out to him, and he asks if he could accompany him as a personal servant during the visit to the palace, to which the boy responds bluntly, who else would it be? In that world, there were armed kings of the underworld who kept their identities secret. The Molan family was the 5th generation of assassins reigning over the eastern underworld, and its successor, Ron Molan, hated and feared the Arm, having spent time hiding from them. But now it was almost time to leave. Kim had no idea about that as he kept pressing the old man on the reason behind his obvious questions, who simply ignores him and comments that the young man would do very well at the palace. Feeling smug, he asks if he doesn't have great looks and a beautiful face, to which Ron agrees, saying he has it all. His response leaves Kim in disbelief. The butler says goodbye, since he had to report to Hans. His overly friendly attitude made him seem like a new man after vacation. Before leaving the room, he promises he'll make sure to pack the wine just as his young master requested. As soon as the door opens, the two cats enter the redhead's room and report that they had discovered a way to take down creatures in berserk mode, but get no major reaction from their owner. Even so, they rub affectionately against his leg, until they smell wolf, which puts them on alert. But it was only Locke who asks for permission to enter. Kim tells the boy to sit, and he seems nervous in his presence. Then he explains that he can say whatever he wants, since it looked like he came because he had something to say. Awkward and a bit explosive, the little wolf thanks him. It was funny, because he seemed naive, scared, and in some ways dumb. He definitely matched the profile described in the novel. And also a bit odd, since he remembered the boy's personality was supposed to change after his first transformation, but he still seemed the same. Emotionlessly, Kim accepts the thanks, and it really was something worth being grateful for, leaving the boy confused. And he tells him to drop the gratitude already, since he could leave now. But the boy had one more thing to say. His nervousness irritated the MC way too much, so he tells him to just spit it out already. Calmly, he explains that when speaking to someone, he should make sure to look directly at the person, the way he was doing, and say what he wanted right away, because at least then he would be listened to. His words seemed to calm the boy down a bit. Locke explains that he was the older brother, so he had to take care of the younger ones. But one day, he had been the youngest son and nephew. Because of all that, he needed to get revenge. Kim knew the young boy had 10 younger siblings to care for and protect. The Blue Wolf tribe had cared for and loved the cowardly Locke, so he couldn't forget all the ones who cared about him one day. That's why he had to make them pay for everything they did to him. That weight left him distraught. When the protagonist calls for his attention, he opens his eyes wide. But what he does is remind the boy that he was a wolf, that he protects his family, and that he gets priority above all else because they had great pride in him. All of this makes Locke really happy. Again, he thanks the redhead and takes the opportunity to ask for help as well. However, our boy says he's not interested in helping him. He had thought a lot over the past few days about how he had acted like trash because of Choi Han and the Black Dragon. The creature alone was already a huge problem, while Choi Han was becoming problematic because of the things that followed him. So he couldn't help Locke so quickly. Kale knew the pain those 10 kids were feeling after losing their parents and support, since he had gone through it himself, but he was already tangled up in that situation and didn't want to be responsible for everything. However, he reveals that he had plans to make a deal with the wolf, who is surprised by the proposal. The redhead asks what he needed help with and what he would do in return. Finally, he tells him to only come see him again once he has answers. Locke thinks for a bit before agreeing to the young master's conditions, promising he would return as soon as he had everything figured out. As the days passed, it was time for Kim to head to the Palace of Joy with the other nobles. The meeting location was called that because it had been built by the king to share his joy over the birth of the prince. Though nowadays the king favored the third prince. Observing it all, the MC realizes it was a structure incomparably more luxurious than the Henatus estate and his residence in the capital. Standing outside, he wonders if Eric, Gilbert, and Amaryl hadn't arrived yet, since they were supposed to handle everything. However, someone's arrival shifts his focus. And damn it, he couldn't believe he was living out a cliche like that right in front of the palace. The guy stepping out of the carriage is all smiles as he greets the famous young master Kale, and immediately asks if he's alone. He couldn't hide the anger on his face when he realized he was face to face with Vinyan's lackey. His name was Neo Tolls, and he was a stereotypical villain, running around fulfilling the twisted desires of the Marquis' second son. In fact, the village where the dragon had been tortured belonged to him, and the Viscount's people had never liked the Hennetus family. Even though they were only separated by a mountain, the wealth gap was huge. In the past, though, they had been friendly with Kale's family, but everything changed when they joined the Marquis faction. That made them a lot bolder. Stai and Kim just wanted to drop dead after running into that guy. Neo dismisses his servant so he can talk to the young master alone, telling the guy to go get permission for them to enter the palace. Now alone, the villain asks what trash like Kale is doing there. So immature. Was it because they were inside a book, or did idiots like him actually exist in the real world too? They definitely must, since the guy was provoking the protagonist like that. But it was insane for a Viscount's son to talk like that to a Count's son. Dealing with that was truly irritating, especially since our boy wasn't even the protagonist of the novel and still had to deal with it. Being around these villains made him consider assigning Ron a shadow mission. Noticing the boy's look of hate, Neo asks if he wants to throw a bottle at his face or beat him up. The dragon also thought he was disgusting. Kim knew he was doing it on purpose. Since magical items weren't allowed inside the palace, there was no way to record any of it. Neo reminded him of that bastard Vinyan, and the redhead explains that he was indeed his lackey. The creature offers to destroy him right then and there, but he doesn't think it's necessary. From afar, the three of them notice another carriage approaching. Finally, Eric and company had arrived. Kim looked relieved by their presence and didn't even have to say anything for the nerd to understand he wanted to ditch Neo. So the boy greets the sour blonde like they were friends, which pisses him off because it seemed like the kid wanted to pamper trash like Kale just because they were on the same side. Behind Eric, Kim watches the scene silently, but his image reminded Neo of Vinyan like a shadow of the guy. The redhead walks away from the two, and the dragon informs him that he recorded everything. That makes him smile. Apparently, he was going to make Neo cry blood with that in the future. And to think the bastard felt safe just because recording devices weren't allowed. Black Dragon cheat mode at its finest. Meanwhile, the trio politely says goodbye to the lackey, led by Eric. As soon as they enter the hall, the name Kale Hennetus is announced, and he looks around without much enthusiasm. Amaral explains to him that at the front of the banquet hall was the prince's throne, while the tables were arranged by region. Shigen thinks about explaining the reason for it, but the redhead understands it perfectly. There were 5 tables in the hall: northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, and central, each representing a noble faction. The prince was actually really good at this. He'd make the factions fight among themselves while forcing them to gather from time to time. Impressive. But he was also super meticulous about his own treatment. The thrones of the second and third princes were on a platform lower than his. He really paid attention to those useless little details. Princes and people in high positions like that were not Kim's type. Eric comments that he expected their table to be near the entrance, and the redhead thinks it's great being close to the door. Besides, they didn't have to bow to anyone just because of where their seats were, which makes the nerd blush. He says their efforts paid off, but Kim had no idea what he was talking about, and asks if something was wrong. But it was just Vinyan Stan and his lackey walking through the door, greeting the young master, who returns the greeting without much energy. But when he feels a weight on his lap, he realizes the dragon is right there, lying down grumpy like a guard dog. He seemed kind of down even while insisting he was fine and that he was a big, powerful dragon. Flashbacks from when they were still at the residence come rushing back, a moment when Kim had warned him that they'd be seeing Vinyan and a noble guest. But of course he couldn't kill him. Today was a very important day. To make sure he'd be left in peace, the redhead states that if the beast didn't eliminate him, he would do it with his own hands later, cutting him into pieces and making sure not even his dust remained. Back at the dinner, the redhead was surprised by the dragon's rationality. It was a relief he wasn't going crazy at that moment. Otherwise, the whole palace would be in ruins, and he'd be a goner. He watched Vinyan slowly coming his way, since the northwest table was very close to his. Eric clears his throat as Kim is lost in thought, thinking about how to ignore the Marquis. But there he was, that blonde mop of wet spaghetti, right behind the boy like a haunting spirit. He gets up, forcing a fake friendliness, commenting how long it's been since they last met. And the blonde did the same, while Neo stared at him with a scowl. Vinyan mentions that earlier that day he was going to visit young Master Neo, and Kim agrees, saying they had promised to have a drink together in the capital. But he adds that a day after that, one of Viscount Toll's knights came to see him. He'd heard that the village had been completely raided and asks if everything was alright. The Marquis's face twists with rage, which he tries not to show as he says he was aware of what happened. Shiki, as always, the redhead says, "You have no idea how shocked I was when I heard that while nursing a hangover." And he says he couldn't understand how something like that could happen so suddenly and across the whole area, leaving Vinyan awkward. He knew there was nothing worse than a loose-tongued person, an idiot, and an innocent. At that moment, Kim was pretending to be all three and doing it flawlessly. Then, with a big smile, he says they should drink to forget such awful things, inviting Neo for a really fun night. He also invites Vinyan, who knew he lost a lot of credibility after losing the Black Dragon. The organization that gave him the creature was the most suspicious, according to the knight's testimonies. But he couldn't shake off the suspicions he had about Kale's group since they were there that night. Still, as if trash like that could manage to steal a dragon. When he finally responds to the invitation, the blonde declines, saying maybe next time. The redhead fakes disappointment and comments that Neo should have prepared himself for that situation. He was crossing a line now, provoking him by asking how he could lose everything all at once, and even if he got it back, it still wouldn't be enough. Vinyan was boiling at those comments, already stressed from the dragon and his crippled brother. Neo was grinding his teeth too, and if it were appropriate, he might have barked at the protagonist. Even so, Kim tells him to cheer up, though he knew Vinyan would soon take all that rage out on his lackey. Little by little, more guests began arriving at the palace. When the redhead grabs the bottle to pour himself a drink, Eric calls his attention. So he decides to drink later, which was probably a good idea for the trio. While everyone chatted among themselves, Kim and Vinyan stayed sulky, already counting the minutes to get out of there. Until finally the reason for all that farce arrived, the prince. He thanks everyone for being there, saying he was very happy to see such precious individuals at the gathering. A noise at the entrance catches the boy's attention, and Kim cracks his smile, because his old friends had arrived. Then Cage and Taylor walk in through the door, grinning from ear to ear. All the guests stare at them in shock, like they'd seen a ghost. Except Kim, who smiled upon seeing the pair decide to reveal their identities despite the trouble the god of death could cause because of it. But it's not like Cage cared about that anyway. Abruptly, Vinyan slams his hand on the table and demands to know what the hell he was looking at. You could see the hatred in his eyes. The prince, on the other hand, smiled at the surprise, confessing that he didn't expect to see them there. Taylor explains that he heard there was an opportunity for nobles to gather and speak with his highness, apologizing for crashing the event. The prince agrees, saying he only invited one representative from each family. But if one didn't have a representative, it was fine if someone else showed up in their place. Suggesting the boy felt left out because the invitation was only for Vinyan, the long-haired man says he was just a little upset. Hearing that guy say his family had no representative only added to Vinyan's growing fury. It was a direct insult to him. In the novel, the crown prince was always wary and alert of the second and third princes, and Marquis Stan was close to the third prince, which was strange. Even though the king favored the third prince, changing the hair wasn't something easy to do, leaving Kim intrigued. And the other nobles also supported other princes, but he had never bothered to learn more about it. He didn't want to get involved, but there was definitely something there. The hair says he feels bad for upsetting Taylor, but was happy to see him healthy, since it had been a while since their last meeting. As always, the long-haired guy feels the need to explain that his legs didn't move, but everything else was alive and even stronger. The young man nods, saying he was very much alive. He had forgotten that the strongest one is the one who survives until the end. That's what he says while Vinyan looks at them like a child. It was a lovely scene. The crown prince, Taylor, Vinyan, and nobles from different factions. Seeing everyone gather during such a sudden event was extremely heartwarming. It was such a good moment that the protagonist regretted not having a bucket of popcorn. When he asked about Cage, he refers to her as the priestess of the god of death, prompting her to introduce herself formally. The conversation was going well, but the blonde ends it, saying the meeting had to begin soon and he still didn't know where to seat the two of them. Looking toward Eric's table, he notices there's a perfect open spot there. It made sense that only that table didn't have high-ranking nobles seated. Even though they had families tied to different factions, there was still a power balance. Besides, there was one family at the table wealthy enough that even the top-ranking nobles wouldn't dare provoke them. So the prince formally announces that they could sit in the empty seats at the table of the northeastern nobles. Neo Tolls was fuming purple with rage at that moment, a joy to witness. Eric and the others rearrange their seats without any problems, and he whispers to the redhead to chill and stick to the plan. Taylor greets the other people at the table before the prince begins to speak. The noble rambles about how he wanted to bring together those responsible for strengthening the kingdom's future so they could share a meal. While he was saying all that formal nonsense nobody really listens to, Kim was watching Vinyan closely. The guy looked pale as a ghost. After the food is served, Emerald comments to the protagonist that she and her group were planning to go greet the monarch shortly. He drifts into thought about the young man's intentions. It made no sense to gather the nobles just to express gratitude. Of course, he had his theories. It could be because of the war in the southeastern region of the West, or maybe he found out about the war that was going to break out in Whipper. Either way, it wasn't something to worry about. He wasn't planning to make any moves. Meanwhile, the little beast drooled over the banquet food and informs the MC that there were video recording devices everywhere, right as he was about to reach for his wine. Thinking about that information, he concluded the blonde was monitoring the nobles with his brother's knowledge. In other words, it was something the entire royal family was behind. The group calmly rises from the table and heads toward the platform. They are welcomed with a warm smile from the monarch. Eric Wheelsman greets him respectfully, and the blonde reminds him they had unfinished business, which puts the nerd on alert. Alvaru Crossman, the prince, had blonde hair as a symbol of the sun's blessing, something unique in his family. The boy agrees with his statement, saying he'd been waiting for the right moment to talk. Then the monarch praises the Wheelsman family for their work on the northeastern road, something impossible to ignore. His comment makes Kim feel satisfied, It seemed like the prince was starting to get it. His persuasion skills were enviable. Noticing his presence, the prince greets the redhead, recognizing the achievements of the Hennetu's family in taking the Forest of Darkness. He adds that he was aware of the young master's reputation for independence. He felt that such independence cleansed the young man's soul in some way, stressing that he wasn't trying to compliment a piece of trash or anything like that. Greeting him, the MC says he also felt something in the prince's presence. He realized that besides the sun, there was also the prince to protect the citizens from darkness. And he smiles, saying it was a beautiful sight, leaving the noble flustered and surprised. He even jokes that he might not be able to sleep now that he had seen the stars shining above his subjects' heads, making the jaws of his peers drop. He was satisfied because with that, he had taken a step further away from the blonde. But then the dragon asks why that weakling dyed his hair with magic. According to him, it was at a level only another dragon would notice, suggesting he had used some very strong power, another secret added to Kim's list. Even his pupils had been dyed. He was clearly planning something, and the little guy warns him to be careful with that one. He was way stronger than he looked. Otherwise, it would end in the worst possible way. That was new information for our boy, who until then had heard that the prince was average. The current queen was the mother of the third prince, because Albert's mother was a palace maid who mysteriously died when he was young. Something was off after all. The boy hadn't said anything about Choi-Han. Was he hiding something? Either way, the redhead pushes the thoughts away. When he finally says something, the prince comments that the MC looked like him, to which he replies with a fake smile, saying that was the greatest honor of his life. He turns to Eric, who stares at him as if his soul had left his body, clearly showing there was something there. A reason for the prince to be aware of the other two and for the king to suddenly start favoring his third son. Maybe Albert wasn't the king's son, or maybe there was some other secret about him. Kim tries to push the thoughts away since he didn't want more problems. Changing the subject, he asks Amaril if the coast of her territory was really as beautiful as they said. She agrees, saying the hills were very pretty. Pretty my ass, thinks the boy. He knew they made it harder for the sound of the wind to pass through. It was the third ancient power discovered by a member of a non-magical faction, a mage hunter strong enough to not need it very often. The magic tower would soon fall. It would be completely destroyed after the war broke out. Then Rosalind would be in charge of building a new one. Meanwhile, Choi, the mage hunter, and the prince would take center stage in the Western incidents as heroes. The novel also showed how the queen of the southern jungle got involved in unifying the region. In short, the continent would break 200 years of peace to fight for power. Even though he was aware of things, Kim knew none of it had anything to do with him. And he asked Gilbert if he could really leave as soon as the meal was over, which the young man confirms. He even comments that the trio would meet with the prince afterward, but he knew that didn't interest the MC, who asks what the point of that would be, using the argument that the three were more informed about investments, which catches the man's attention. He's surprised and asks if Kim actually read the documents they sent him, and he says he did take a look. Albert finally finishes his meal, inviting everyone to enjoy the wines he had prepared and reminding them of his birthday. The redhead knew that reminder was basically a summons, meaning everyone had to go, so he'd be in the square when the bombs were about to explode. Cage and Taylor walk past him, saying goodbye and calling him little brother. That forced closeness worries him a bit, but Amaril interrupts his thoughts by asking to walk with him. And the young master asks if she was offering just to prevent any possible mess he might cause on the way out. Then the lady says that unfortunately, Neo had also come back earlier. It seemed like she meant that he might try to stir up some trouble. Walking him outside the palace, Amaril praises the protagonist for his behavior, but she knew she herself needed to put in more effort to achieve good results. Even though she spoke casually, it was a desperate situation. The northeastern coast was useless and dangerous for anyone who wasn't an experienced sailor, and all of that was thanks to the sound of the wind. Amaril and Gilbert wanted investments for that sea full of whirlpools no matter what. Surprisingly, the woman seemed quite optimistic that she would achieve the desired results. Kim says the prince will show interest in it and wonders if he should help them since they were working so hard for it. And Amaril was known for keeping her mouth shut, so he asks if they had discussed investments for tourism, and the woman confirms. He suggests she think in terms of the local value of the northeastern coast in relation to the Whipper Kingdom and the other northern kingdoms. His statement surprises her, but the young man continues, saying it would be better if she kept that suggestion to herself. As she sees him getting into the carriage, she says she'll remember the redhead's words, which leaves her there stunned. Amaril and Gilbert's territory has a complex coastline with many small islands, as well as steep cliffs surrounding them. In his carriage, Kim reflects that the two only thought about tours and sightseeing because peace had lasted so long there, but that would soon change. Before the mage assassin could act, he needed to retrieve the ancient power hidden on the coast, and that was all that mattered. Back at the residence, the redhead is greeted by Choi, who eagerly informs him that he had discovered the location of the magic bombs. He continued, saying everything was located near the plaza, so the MC asks him to show the map, which the young master lays out on the table to examine. Catching his breath, Choi-Han says, "When I found the first one, I searched the surroundings with the dragon and found 3 more. The black dragon watched the two as they discussed plans, while the hero explained that they had run across the entire plaza, so there was no place they hadn't checked. However, Kim knew the novel mentioned 5 bombs linked to people and 5 to locations. Maybe this time there were 6 linked to people and 4 to places. Even with that unexpected twist, he tells the swordsman not to rush because everything would be fine until the celebration, even if he wanted to get rid of those things already. But when he informs him that they'd steal the bombs on the morning of the celebration, Choi Han is shocked. The protagonist knew that a signal was needed to trigger them, but cutting off that signal's connection would be easy. Anyone on the level of the dragon or Rosalind could do that without trouble, even if it took time. That's how she freed people from the bombs in the novel. They just had to do it on the day of the celebration. That was the only way to make the vampire mage believe everything was going according to plan. Choi Han asks if they were only going to steal the items instead of destroying them, which makes the MC ask why they would destroy something so useful. And he explains that he planned to use them, not the bombs themselves, but the mana densely stored within them. Either way, he asked them to keep looking for more traps and to make sure the current ones were still in the same place marked on the map. That way, they'd stay busy, even if it was exhausting and boring for both of them. Now it was time for the furballs to get to work. Smiling, Kim tells the 2 of them to get to work, and so they do, heading toward the terrace balcony. The day before the king's birthday celebration, our boy finds out about Billow's arrival in the capital. Inside the carriage, Ian Locke talk about the boy's condition in order to return the favor that had been done. The noble should take care of his siblings, and in exchange, he and his family would work together to act more precisely. The little guy explains that the Blue Wolf tribe was known for producing strong knights, but Kim frowns, saying he'd never heard of that story. Locke asks if he wants to hear the explanation, but he's cut off. It was crazy. He was suggesting the redhead form a knight squad with Locke and 10 more kids from his tribe. Even if he was afraid of the whale tribe, the little wolf was ready to go after his chief for the sake of his friends. Kim tells him to quit the nonsense. After all, he wanted him to protect his family, and now he was suggesting building an army with children. If they train knights from such a young age, they become a group of warriors more insane than those guys who really love white powder. And he asks him what the others would think about that, since the boy was making decisions for the whole group, which embarrasses him, and he apologizes to the protagonist. But he explains that he doesn't need to apologize, and he already knew what favor the boy wanted so badly, so he'd think carefully about what to ask of Locke in return. Even though they already knew he wouldn't need anything for at least 3 months. He knew that an ancient power capable of helping him make money would appear in a dangerous mountain that the berserk-transforming little wolf could climb in 1 minute. If he sold the power to the queen of the jungle, even if the Henatu's territory went bankrupt, he'd have money for the rest of his life. Catching his attention, Locke asks if there really was anything he could be useful for. That makes the MC scoff, telling him to stop asking the obvious. He already knew someone like him couldn't possibly be useless. The carriage drops them off in front of an establishment, which the boy stares at curiously while Kim guides him. The 2 are welcome at Scent of Grapes, and the man who receives them asks if they were all together. The redhead looks at the teenager, explaining that he should open the door because his siblings were inside. Tense, Locke carefully turns the doorknob and finds several children in the room. They run toward him, wrapping their big brother in a warm group hug. Outside, Billows greets the Great Master, who greets him back as if third person celebrates his first meeting with the redhead. It was a bearded man, a merchant who had taken the piglet to the capital and felt honored to meet Kale Henatus, which surprises him since meeting the trash of the family wasn't exactly an accomplishment. Still, the 2 shake hands, and the mustached man introduces himself as Odious Flynn. He was a strong competitor for the position of leader of the Flynn Merchant Guild, but ended up stepping down the Start Zone Guild. Or, more simply, he was Billow's uncle. He was the one who connected Choi Han and the chubby blonde, bringing out his nephew's greed. He managed to be even more deceitful than Ron. He acted like the owner of a small merchant guild, but in truth, he was wearing a mask to rule the underworld. He was one of those people who were super kind to some and complete bastards to others. With his usual great acting, Kim says it's a pleasure to meet someone from Billow's family. And Odious confesses that it was a surprise for him that his nephew knew the young master, since he hadn't seen him since he was a little boy. Laughing, he comments that he'd had several good encounters lately. The old guy left his guild behind to live a simpler life, and he was a good uncle. He was also the only person Billows had good childhood memories of. At least for him, he was someone with a good heart. Kim calls the piggy over to have a drink while they wait for Choi Han and Rosalind, who would update them on the news. Odious says his goodbyes, saying he hoped they'd get a chance to drink together in the future, and Kim replies that they'll definitely do it someday. Inside the establishment, the children kept thanking him non-stop, which was already getting on his nerves. Looking at that group, he thought they could use a trainer instead of a babysitter. But he wouldn't do that, no matter how much he wanted to. He dismisses them all for the outing he mentioned in the carriage. When left alone with Billows, a blonde asks what he'd been doing all this time. The question confuses him, and he replies that he's been doing everything he could for a peaceful future, which makes the bastard squint and down an entire glass of wine in one go without even offering any to the redhead. Such rudeness irritates Kim, who asks if he didn't see him sitting right there in front of him, prompting Billows to apologize and explain that he was just frustrated. Getting a bit impatient, the noble says he doesn't know what's bothering the chubby guy, but he shouldn't be drinking alone like that. He grabs the wine to serve himself when the boy breaks the silent tension between them and confesses that Odious was his blood uncle. For him who couldn't use the Flynn surname, he couldn't even call his uncle uncle. Even so, Odious was the only adult who treated him kindly during his childhood. He saw him as a family member and had even said he was qualified for that in the novel. That sentence became a turning point and a change for the boy. After being introduced to Choi Han by his uncle, he decided to follow him and compete for the leadership of the Flynns. Billows asks if the young man wasn't curious why the mustached man had a small guild despite his surname, and he asks if he should be curious. Apparently, Flynn wasn't anything special, and Kim says that regardless of who it was, they were all the same to him. After all, the blonde was also a Flynn. Didn't matter if he was a bastard or not, everyone saw him as a Flynn. The comment seems to cheer up the piggy, who compliments the MC for his way with words, and he laughs, reaffirming that he really had a way with it. The two share the bottle, and Billows explains that's exactly why he wanted to ask what he stole with the items he borrowed from him. Our boy says he had already stolen one thing, but he'd get the rest soon, and the blonde asks if he could join him, but he says the spots are already filled. At night, back in his residence, our boy receives Ron in his room to hear a request. Something he finds strange, but the butler stares at him seriously and asks that he take good care of his son. Confused, he confirms that he's referring to Beecrox and asks why he'd need care. Then the old man explains that he would be absent for a while to hunt some foxes. For the first time, he directly mentions the fact that he's someone who destroys people. But the redhead doesn't understand the relevance of that at the moment until Ron clarifies that this was the reason for his absence, leaving his son behind. Confirming his suspicions, Kim asks if the foxes were in fact humans, and the butler says he had a group of foxes to take care of, saying he would cut them to pieces, which scares the boy. Either his servant was about to become dog food or his targets would be served as stew for dinner. There was no reason for him to be with Choi Han now. With Locke's berserk state under control, he'd be fine even without Ron or Beecrox. Kim was disturbed by the crazy smile on the old man's face. It would have been much better if he had stayed serious. Even so, he asked him to go and come back, saying he would say he was on vacation, and he asked him to keep him updated, letting him know how he could receive money from the Flynn. But he can't help but ask why he was leaving his son with trash like him. Beecrox was an adult, so he knew what to do with his own life. And he warned that this vacation could only last up to a year, and during that time, he would sleep like an angel. He tells him to make the most of it and try not to get hurt while hunting. Before he leaves, Ron stares at the boy. He thought he was a son of a bitch, but it seemed like he himself was the stubborn one. The two agree to exchange information once a month, and then the butler says he would be back in a year. Like an assassin, that's what Kim thinks, but he doesn't say anything else. The old man left without a single step being heard. The next morning, everyone gathered in Kale Henatus's chambers. The redhead compliments Rosalind's new hair, which she had dyed to walk around unnoticed. She had no idea what they were going to do that day, but she understood the gravity of the problem after hearing the words magic bomb. Kim confirms that Locke can use the physical strength of wolves without transforming into one, which fortunately is the case. And he splits him and Rosalind into one team, Choi Han and the dragon into another, and Hong as the third. When the mage questions what he would be doing in the meantime, the hero tries to explain that the redhead's strength was kind of different. But the dragon flat out says he was a weak human, and the cats add that his strength was useless and unnecessary. He didn't seem offended by that. In fact, Kim says he would only get in the way, and besides that, needed to prepare for the celebration as soon as the sun rose. His team would take advantage of the guard's shift change to enter the areas where the bombs were located and dismantle them. Afterward, while the black orb activates and causes a mana disturbance, everyone would wait to observe the members of the secret organization and the situation at the plaza. The celebration would begin at 9 in the morning, so the redhead feels the need to get them working immediately. Rosalind reminds him that he had promised to give her one of the bombs after the dismantling, which would be enough to pay for her services. Kim watches the group leave his room, closing the terrace door as he is left alone. Even with everything shut, a flash and a gust of wind hit him, revealing the summoning of his indestructible shield, which he didn't intend to use, but if necessary, he would only use a fraction of its power. However, he knew he wouldn't go near the crazy mage, so it would be fine. Before he leaves, he comments that that would be the last day Ron would serve him, which the butler hoped to be able to hear a year from then. It was a horrible thought for the redhead, who would send him straight to Choi Han once he returned. But for now, the focus was something else. The carriage keeps going while the young man questions why he needed to be accompanied. In front of him, Emerald was asking his opinion about building a naval base in her territory. He'd already received a letter from Eric saying the discussion about tourism investments hadn't gone well. So he thought Gilbert and Emerald would be very upset, but they didn't seem that way. Smiling subtly, Kim asks if she hadn't already made up her mind, which she says she had but didn't think it was something to decide alone. So she spoke with her mother and planned to discuss it with Gilbert later that day. Creating a military base wasn't easy. Money wasn't the problem. The real complication was the power dynamics within the territory, especially now. That's why the Crown had its eyes on the Northeast. East was the only side with ocean access, but only in the Northeast was there a balance of power. Knowing that, Kim asks if she was more concerned about the crown's power increasing there, and she confirms, explaining that's why she asked for time with the young man. So she really had something to say. The redhead says he is curious about the question she was going to ask, but he had something to say first. Any decision regarding the Hennetus family's funds is made solely by my father, he explains. He knew that Emerald wanted to prevent that, and there was only one way: to borrow from someone who had money. She then mentions that Albir was aware of the Whipper Kingdom and the Northern Kingdoms. She figured that out based on their conversation, which yielded information through the guild. So the prince and the royal family were aware that the kingdom would face a civil war soon and that the North was gathering forces. That was unexpected, because Kim had heard that the woman's family had been relying on the wheelsmen since they weren't doing too well. Even so, he spent money to buy information about another country. However, all he says is that Trash like him had no power to make decisions. When a military base is located outside the crown's territory, there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. Knowing about the construction in the northeast, the crown would invest a lot of money, so its possession would go to the royal family. There was a significant difference in funding and manpower required to run a military base compared to tourism. The families of Emerald and Gilbert had average wealth both in manpower and money to complete a project of that size. Even so, he liked seeing how they could make bold investments when necessary. Returning to the conversation, the lady mentions that she knew the Hennetus territory was strengthening its walls, which showed interest in military forces. Kim assures her that he will talk to his father about it, and the girl insists on sending an official request as well. If that naval base really were to be created, the balance of power in the northeast would tip in favor of the families of Kale, Eric, Amaryl, and Gilbert. If the Hennetus family provided the funding, then they would receive multifaceted support from the base. The woman reflects for a moment before revealing her concern about the whirlpools, intriguing the MC. But she herself counters that there were paths used for ages, so they could serve as a defense to prevent invasions. That's why she wanted to test the plan. Her words make the boy smile. If she was worried about the whirlpools, then they would soon be under her control, which wouldn't be a problem in the near future. He even got excited about the idea of building a house on one of the cliffs to enjoy the sunset in the future. Since it would be complicated to stay in the Hennetus residence after handing over control to Basin, he would have to hide out in a remote place during the war. He can go to the cliffs after the war to build a house and relax. Wrapping up the topic, the girl thanks him, and he says she shouldn't thank Trash like him. With a smile and a friendly tone, he says he was just delivering her message. Emerald should be cautious when she has no power, but to win, she had to be bold. Delivering the message was already enough, and she made that clear. She invited him to visit the Ubar territory in the future, saying there were many interesting places to see. Sealing the deal with a handshake, Kim says he will go as soon as he gets the chance. It was exactly 8 o'clock when the two arrived at the destination. The team responsible for preparing the Glory Square would arrive an hour early, and at 8:30 the Royal Knights would allow people in, which would cause the square to fill up. It would be difficult for anyone to enter or leave, and at that moment, the shadow game he had planned with his team would begin. The bombs would be hidden in all kinds of things: necklaces, bags, pendants, and of course, several people. But he mentally pictured Choi Han and his group being the ones responsible for finding them. Lost in thought, the MC only came back to reality when someone called for his attention. It was just Eric and Gilbert. In the end, Kim didn't care if they didn't find all the bombs, because the answer would reveal itself. Saying that they'd start acting at 8:05, the nerd told Kale not to screw up again that day, and the redhead planned to play dumb. He didn't know a damn thing, including what shocked the trio at that moment. The prince had arrived and was talking to Taylor, who was standing up. They were horrified, wondering how that was possible, but Kim only paid attention to the Black Dragon, who announced his arrival. He had only come to report on the progress of the plans, explaining that they finished disarming everything at 8:55 as planned, and he told the MC to use his shield if he felt he was about to get hurt. Everyone got into the carriage while he wondered why the creature had mentioned the indestructible shield, since Kim knew he wouldn't use it. Albrecht looked at everyone with that fake pleasant expression, asking if they could move on. But the protagonist kept a scowl on his face, wondering if the prince had put them together on purpose. There was Neo, forcing a cheerful attitude as he greeted Emerald. He didn't intend to pretend in there. All he could think about was the chaos that was about to unfold. In fact, it was already pretty chaotic in there. Amaryl and Taylor exchanged friendly glances while Neo looked confused. If he stopped to think, Kim figured most noble successors seemed confused. Minion, for example, was a complete mess. After all, no one expected Taylor Stan, the eldest son, to get up from his wheelchair and walk on his own feet just like that. Even less that someone from the Marquis Stan family would stand next to Alberu, the first prince. Apparently, the guy got the Star of Healing, and Amaryl was particularly interested in the boy's sudden recovery. which he explains happened because he was healed by a blessing from the heavens, receiving congratulations for it. Neo was very intrigued by all of it and couldn't take his eyes off the heavens' favorite. Full of curiosity, he asks if the young man would return to the Marquis estate now that he was walking again. But the hare doesn't understand what he meant by return, since that place had always been his home. It was obvious that he belonged there, which leaves his brother's lackey flustered. Kim stares at him in silence while Taylor confesses that he's excited to tell everyone how he managed to walk again, something the redhead had already guessed. Upon arriving at the plaza, Neo volunteers to go ahead, leaving the others behind. Next to say goodbye is Amuro, who tells Kim that she'll return with Eric in his carriage, which shouldn't be a problem since, to her, young Master Taylor and Kale had no prior relationship. So only the two of them remained in the vehicle, and the hare celebrates the fact that they were finally alone. He quickly spills it. His leg had been fixed based on a promise to become the head of the Marquis estate, and the MC asks if he had pledged loyalty, which the young man denies, saying it was just an agreement. Fredling, the redhead, congratulates him for having regained his legs, until Taylor pulls out a paper with the terms of the exchange for our boy to take a look, but he makes it clear he didn't need to receive that. However, the blonde insists it'd be good for the young master to read what was there. Before opening it, he reveals that Cage would be excommunicated, commenting that the girl was glowing with joy over it, and Kim celebrates. Next, the hare says they would be very victorious together, catching the young man's attention, who wondered why he included him in that "we," correcting him by stating that he would be very victorious. Taylor steps down from the carriage to head forward, suggesting that the three of them go drinking after celebrating his victory, to which the protagonist replies, "Hennetus wine is certainly delicious." Now alone, he finally feels safe enough to open the paper with the conditions, which stated that the first prince wished to avoid civil war. That stresses him out because it meant there was a secret about the first prince's birth, just as he suspected. As he steps out of the carriage, the trio of friends catches his attention. They were hurrying him as it was already his turn to go in. In the novel, Choi Han was ranked above the commoners. Even so, he was still the bottom of the social pyramid compared to the royal family. It was 8:25, time for the nobles and priests to enter and block the commoners from entering. Gilbert asks if it was the young master's first time in the plaza, which he confirms, explaining that he had only passed through by carriage, so it was the first time he saw it fully. Now he was observing the tea shop to the south, the inn to the west, a flower shop to the east, and finally the top of the ceramic guild's building to the north. It really was a very spacious place. Sweeping the area with his eyes, Kim realizes that things were going according to plan. From afar, one of the officers commands the soldiers to open the way, confirming that the time to play treasure hunt had arrived. Of course, there wasn't a real need to find it like that, since the answer would show up at 9-1. One of the attendants guides Kim's group to their seats at the table, very close to Taylor, who comments that the two of them seem to be running into each other quite often lately. Sitting down, the redhead agrees. Apparently, the chair arrangement was the same as at the banquet. As soon as he finishes settling in, Eric grabs his attention and tells him to shut up. And with a mischievous look, he states that he would do absolutely nothing. The stars of the royal family were announced on time, and the little dragon, watching from a distance, announces that 15 minutes remain. Kim knew there was nothing the little one couldn't do with magic. The crown arrived in luxurious carriages, but what caught the boy's attention was the creature's accusation that Albier's hair and eyes were dyed. In reality, he had the most common colors possible: brown hair and eyes. When the son of the Roan Kingdom, King Zed Crossman, arrives, the commoners go wild. But Kim couldn't care less, turning his attention to a plant vase that was hiding one of the bombs, celebrating the fact that it had already been disarmed. With everyone seated, silence fell over the area as they waited for the monarch's speech. Then he begins, "It has been 30 years since this king received the blessing of the sun to rule this kingdom." And he even seemed genuinely happy about it, which was a shame. The clock struck 9 on the dot, and that's where Kim focused his attention. Suddenly, the nobles around him tensed up as they noticed something different in the atmosphere. Everyone watched something with curiosity, wondering who those people were. From atop the tower, a man in the organization's uniform stared at them like a psychopath. Quickly, officers moved toward the tower to stop him. It was Redika, the ink-thirsty mage. Kim had been worried he wouldn't show up this time, because if he hadn't, it would have been a pain to go look for him. But it would have been Choi Han doing that, not the MC. In the novel, the hero could hear the mage announcing the terrible hour. Meanwhile, the blonde didn't waste time summoning his powers. And just like in the story, he said, "This is going to be fun," while unleashing his dark powers upon the city. He gathered a mass of red mana in his hands, which exploded like fire. His movements caught the attention of Rosalind, Choi Han, and Locke, who were strategically hidden. Ken was also surprised, activating the Black Orb's ability, which would last 10 minutes just like they'd agreed. Then his team moved into action at the plaza. Even if they couldn't disarm everything in that time, it would be enough to take the bombs to the mountains, where they could explode without harming anyone. Flying over the chaos, the Black Dragon reported that he had already found one of the traps. When Choi Han grabbed one of the nobles who was still sitting, Kim watched closely. The man was wearing a suspicious necklace, which could be one of the hidden bombs. So the hero yanked the cord off his neck, leaving him confused. But the show ended for the redhead, as Eric pulled him harshly, worried about his friend in the middle of all that chaos. Meanwhile, an officer was explaining to Albira that they needed to evacuate the area quickly, which brought the MC's attention back to the boy's hair. The prince was sweating bullets, but his features remained intact. Kim remembered the dragon's words about how another dragon might have dyed the boy's hair or used a different kind of power. Freaking out in front of him, the nerds screamed that they had to get the hell out of there fast. Redika kept unleashing all his power there, but was getting annoyed by all the shouting. Then he cast a spell that made countless arrows fall from the sky. 2 more people with bombs had been found, making it 3 out of the 6 present, which left Kim grumpy. Eric was still in panic mode, trying to convince his friend to move with the group's help. But the redhead only stared at the situation with displeasure, until finally he said something. "Eric, you need to calm down," were the words that came out of his mouth. However, shouting caught both their attention before the boy could respond. It was commoners desperately begging for the guards to open the passage that was being blocked, while the guards insisted they wait. Surprisingly, Kim's words helped Eric calm down a little. He took a deep breath and thanked him. There were still 2 minutes left before the orb's effect ended, and the mages were busy creating a mana stabilization zone. Choi Han found another bomb planted in a citizen's bag. Now only 2 were left. Even so, the redhead looked calm, even with the possibility that they could detonate before being found. To him, 2 minutes was plenty of time, until someone said it was done, and his expression changed completely. That made Taylor worried. What did they mean there were only 4 bombs? Kim was sure the novel mentioned 10 bombs and wondered if the number had changed because the story had altered. The mages managed to activate the mana stabilization, which should trigger the traps to explode. However, as expected, Rosalind and the dragon managed to protect everyone with the bombs positioned outside the protective barrier they created. With full stabilization, everyone could see the bombs exploding outside, shocked by the scene. Taylor asked if those really were magical traps, something any noble would recognize. Relieved, Kim concluded that there really were only 4. Meanwhile, the little dragon was full of joy after confirming that they really had saved the humans there. Not just that, he saved the humans there. No one died, just like it had been planned. At the top of the tower, Redika was stunned, lamenting that no one got hit and wondering why his subordinates blew up the mountains. Apparently, it had been a major screw-up. His moment of reflection was interrupted by the king, who roared, asking who that lunatic was. Hearing the crazy mage's words, Kim got so tense that not even Wi-Fi signals could get through him. If that had been a failure, then was there something else planned? Meanwhile, Zen shouted for his guards to go after that delinquent. But the blonde doesn't seem the least bit worried and only laments the failure of his plan. When 3 men flee through the towers, Kim notices that the remaining bombs are inside the backpacks of one of them. They were probably members of the assassin team whose lives didn't matter, judging by their shield, acceleration, and magic combustion powers. The mage orders them to move forward, scaring the citizens in the plaza. Apparently, they were heading toward the area occupied by nobles. Again, Eric insists that they leave immediately, backed by Amaryl. But it was too late to dodge, since it was impossible to get out of the blast range just by running for a few seconds. Kim knew he would lose an arm when the bombs exploded, but he could regrow it using the heart's vitality. However, the people around him weren't as lucky, and they would never recover their limbs if it came to that. So it was time to change plans. The dragon brings Rosalind to him. With blood in her eyes, the mage creates a new barrier around the nobles nearby, while Redika unleashes an explosion spell in their direction. But the redhead activates his indestructible shield upon spotting the 2 armed men with the bombs, drawing the girl's attention. They're startled by his perception, and the dragon helps block them. It's as if they're floating in a sphere of mana suspended in the air. Irritated and confused, Rosalind questions the young master's actions, but he tries to hold firm, at least until he realizes his power isn't enough to contain what's about to happen. Then the bombs explode inside the barrier held up by the young man and the creature. The blast is strong enough to break that mana containment, reaching the citizens. A man screams in pain after his arm is hit, while a woman tries to recover from the impact. Eric is stunned by what's happening. There it was, the indestructible shield, still suspended in the air, though damaged. Kim feels his body ache from the massive explosion, but stays on his feet, maintaining the remaining power. When he finally collapses, someone shouts in his direction. It's Rosalind, worried about the young man. His hands were throbbing and he hated feeling pain, which made everything worse. Thanks to the Black Dragon, he managed to use less of the shield's power, but it still hurt. The group of nobles surrounding him asks if he's okay. He even tries to say he's fine, but the red liquid coming out of his mouth says otherwise. Watching the scene, Eric snaps. Still, Kim feels his body gaining more energy and calming down as expected from the heart's vitality. His limbs were still attached to his body, and even though his hands throbbed, it didn't hurt as much as a paper cut. A single cough was enough, and he smiled, thinking how he now understood why the old heroes preserved that ability at all costs, which makes Rosalind ask if he thought all of that was funny. Taylor yells at him to stop laughing and close his eyes, sounding very irritated, which deeply confuses the redhead. Even the dragon flies overhead, shouting, "Weak human, you can't die. I swear you're so weak. If this happens, I'll kill everyone." And not just everyone, he would end himself too. It was weirdly affectionate, even if it sounded brutal. Gilbert and Amaryl offer to call a priest for the young master, But honestly, he wasn't suffering. Even so, he admitted it would be good to get checked out and he needed to pretend to be injured. From afar, Choi Han was speaking with an officer to gain entry. It didn't seem friendly at all, even though he was saying please. The officer was yelling in his face that citizens weren't allowed in, which was a dumb rule to the hero. Kim was frustrated because he had been clear when he told him not to go there. Taylor watched him closely as the young man realized he wasn't welcome. With disappointment in his eyes, he steps back, apologizing. Not that he needed to, but he did it anyway, being consoled by the cats. Rosalind checks again with Kim if everything was really okay, and he nods. The girl was impressed by the young man's calmness after doing something so incredible. Even someone from the royal family like her wouldn't know how to handle it that way. And without meaning to, she blurts out that she couldn't understand the redhead, who stares at her confused. Suddenly, the two of them spot something unbelievable. It was the Mad Mage floating above them while commenting that the situation was totally unexpected, but very fun. When his eyes meet Rosalind's, it feels like they both saw hell on earth. He knew she was the woman he had seen in the Blue Wolf village during the fire. That was great for the blonde, who declares that there were many paint colors he liked. Enough colors to want to put all of them on display. The guy was completely nuts, and Choi Han looked at him with concern. It was unusual because the MC knew that characters like that usually got written out of stories quickly. The officers decided to attack him using arrows fused with mana, drawing his attention while the king ground his teeth in hatred toward Redika, who said goodbye to the crowd before being struck, disappearing into the air with the people he had brought. Probably no one had any idea where that lunatic had gone with that special teleportation magic of his. But in the birth of a hero, his destination was mentioned. It was the place where Kim had previously sent Choi, On, Hong, and Locke. If Redika and the members of the secret organization really showed up there, they'd end up getting destroyed by the swordsman, who would probably go berserk. Even so, to prevent that from happening, Kim had sent the other three with him, so there was nothing to worry about. It would help keep the hero rational, since children were his greatest weakness. After the shock passed, the king spoke up, assuring that he would do his best so they could recover from such a terrible incident. And he asked that everyone present follow the crown's orders and focus on calming down and resting. He announced that the celebration would be continued on another day. Originally, Rosalind had planned to keep her presence there as hidden as possible, but it seems she had shown up to help the protagonist, who figured she had done it because the Black Dragon couldn't. The two exchanged glances and the young woman smiled sweetly, asking him to keep it a secret, which made him smirk, knowing they understood each other very well. That morning, he had given instructions to 6 people before they left. First, the trio made up of the dragon and the beast tribe kids couldn't reveal their identities under any circumstances. Second, if Choi Han and Rosalind happened to be recognized, they should act as if it was just a coincidence they were there. And lastly, none of them were to harm one another. Seeing how well it all worked out, Kim and the mage exchanged satisfied looks. But the peace was interrupted by the priest, who yelled out for the young master alongside Amaryl. He was in such a hurry that he was panting as he asked what happened. Holding out his hands, the boy explained that he was in more pain than he expected and asked him to take a look at them. And he commented that protecting others was a really tough job, which the priest doctor agreed with. He said he had seen the redhead's silver shield and that it was incredible. From the corner of his eye, Kim noticed Albir was there too, while enjoying the attendant's care, saying that apparently it was his first time seeing an ancient power. His moment of fame ended when he felt a hand weigh down on his shoulder. It was the first prince, whispering in his ear that he had already figured everything out. He greeted him formally, ready to squeeze everything he could out of the situation now that he had revealed his trump card. Glory wasn't enough to pay for all the sacrifice he'd made, but money definitely was. To the boy, being rich was much better than being a hero. The prince called him, pulling him into a hug as he thanked him for what he'd done, but then discreetly asked if the two of them weren't the same. He seemed annoyed, but Kim actually agreed with what he said. So Albert continued, "I'll make sure there's nothing annoying and I'll reward you well. What do you say?" It was enough to make him squeeze the blonde and say he was giving him too much credit, that he was just doing what he had to do. But since poor people's joy never lasts, the little dragon warned him that there was something strange about that situation. Even so, at that point, he could have taken a pillar from the first prince's palace. A few moments later, the nobles were getting ready to return to the palace, and Albir insisted that the savior of everyone be the first to enter the carriage. But he pretended to be modest, asking how he could go in before his highness, which surprised the dragon, and he asked for the redhead and hit his head or something. Still, the prince insisted that this was his way of showing gratitude, so Kim accepted, saying that he, a mere inferior servant, would board first. Before getting in, he noticed how Eric and his friends looked really worried about him. While Veniam was practically chewing his own arm in frustration at realizing the power of someone like Kale Henatus. It didn't matter. Deep down, he was loving seeing that bitter blonde and his lackey eaten up with jealousy. Maybe he could get rid of Neo once and for all. That's what he was thinking as the prince ordered his servant to treat Rosalind as an honored guest. And he wouldn't need to worry about anything, since the young woman was very trustworthy. Inside the vehicle, the redhead noticed that this was a next-level ride with impressively soft leather seats. The prince broke the silence by asking if the young man needed medical treatment. Kim explains that even though he feels healthy, it would still be good if the best priest doctors could take a look at him, just to be sure. And he confesses that all he really wanted was to be left in peace for 3 or 4 days, which was perfectly fair in Albir's opinion. After all, the young man had saved everyone, and the most logical thing to do was to give him the proper treatment. He nods, grateful for the understanding. However, the monarch breaks the calm mood by asking if the boy was with them. By them, he meant the people who showed up during the attack on the plaza. Flashbacks come rushing in of when the dragon had gone up to Kim to ask why the prince hadn't done anything while the other humans were in danger, especially considering he was strong, which makes the young man wonder if the blonde had been hiding his strength all along. Thinking about it, he didn't step in even when one of his servants was annihilated or when a young knight had his arm and leg blown off. Kim used to think he was kind even though he had a habit of using others, but now, maybe not. Keeping up the act, the redhead asks the monarch why he would be part of something so bothersome, and the noble agrees. He figured someone who hides like trash wouldn't do such a thing. He was certain he only got involved because he had no other choice, and he warns that the crown might try to investigate him. But Kim asks and his highness wouldn't stop them. Pulling back the curtain of the vehicle, the young man asks why he's stating the obvious, revealing the commoners who admired him. He waves in an exaggerated display, stating that they finished the conversation after he visited the redhead to check on his health. So the MC says that if it was to have a conversation with the star of the nation, he would always be available. It seems to leave the boy speechless with that strange kindness, adding that he didn't want his actions to be too much when preparing for the public, to just enough to keep them from complaining about the crown. Either way, the blonde thanks him for having prevented a large number of casualties. It was strange because Kim couldn't tell if he was good or bad. To be honest, you couldn't even tell if he was truly human. Despite that, he says he's looking forward to receiving his reward soon, which disappoints Albaru, but he knew a decent sum of money would be given for his actions. Arriving at the palace, the MC was receiving far better treatment than before. He was in the best room in the residence, one that usually housed royalty. Upon hearing a knock at the door, he sits up in bed and tells them to come in. It was his friends, and Hans, who was crying from worry, exclaiming how concerned he had been about the young man, which was kind of pathetic. As soon as he sees the blonde approaching, the young master tells him to stop, and orders everyone to come into the room at once. Composing himself, the butler informs him that he had already notified his family about the incident so they'd hear it before the crown announced anything. That's why it took him so long to show up, and Kim praises him for the good work. Before he can continue, he freezes upon recognizing Rosalind's true identity, as her red hair had returned. So the young man insists that his servant continue, hearing that he had told the servants at the residence to stay quiet about the mage for now. This time it's her who congratulates him. The two redheads exchange knowing glances, both certain that this was the best course of action, especially since they hadn't had a chance to talk privately yet. Hans suggests that the young master contact his family personally later, or Daruth might come all the way to the capital. The butler takes his leave, saying he's going to speak with the rest of the servants in the house. Without him present, the dragon feels comfortable enough to reveal himself to Kim, saying there were no recording devices in the room, which made sense. It was a room for foreign royalty. Placing surveillance, there could easily be grounds for war. That meant they could say whatever they wanted inside. Still, Rosalind puts up a protective barrier, staying the safer the better. Kim found the girl admirable. She had cast soundproof magic even when there was nothing suspicious around. With everything set, he asks Choi Han to report everything that happened that morning, and the hero looks at him seriously. The swordsman begins by saying that the enemies had shown up exactly where the redhead said they would, and he was ready to take down the mage. But his subordinates had charged at him, bringing back the memories from earlier that day. He had been surrounded by hooded figures, all ready to be destroyed. He remembered how he had raised his sword, declaring that the people precious to him had died or barely survived because of those bastards. With a manic look in his eyes, he lunged at the mage, who suddenly vanished. It was sad to admit that he had escaped, but even so, Choi Han didn't hide the truth. However, he didn't skip over the fact that he managed to get one of his arms, which surprised Kim. And just to be sure, he burned the limb. Who knows, maybe Redika had plans to recover and reattach it. Besides that, he also managed to injure his left eye. Those wounds were serious for a mage. They needed to channel energy through their hands to balance mana, so losing one was practically a death sentence. Even after all that, Choi Han apologized for not fulfilling his duty, to which the redhead replied that there was nothing to apologize for. In fact, Locke and the kittens looked frightened by the whole situation, which made him consider whether the swordsman had entered berserk mode. But he didn't ask about that. He was more curious about what he had done to the henchmen. And the boy calmly replied that he thought it was best to finish them all off once and for all to avoid future problems. Worried, the redhead asked if he hadn't broken any buildings or anything like that, since he'd be the one to clean up the mess. But thankfully, that wasn't the case, and the hero assured him he had made sure not to damage anything in the area. Suddenly, the cats jumped off Locke's lap, heading toward the dragon on the bed. It seemed they were afraid of Choi Han. Kim said the team had worked hard and the people had survived thanks to them. He took the chance to praise Miss Rosalind separately, and even the black dragon spoke up, saying the weak human had also worked hard for the sake of the people, which the redhead acknowledged with a slight smile. But what really got him excited was the fact that he'd soon receive proper rewards for it. After dismissing the group, our boy received a visit from the prince, who asked how he was feeling. He said he was fine and very flattered that His Highness had come to check on him. His words were borderline disturbing to the blonde. Still, the protagonist thanked him again. Albir explained that he had told people he was recovering, and that even though it had been a tough task, he took action at the plaza because it was his duty as a noble. Smirking mischievously, he mentioned that since Kale had brought up the ancient power, he had to manipulate the people into thinking it was just something defensive, and confirmed that that was what the young master wanted, and he replied that it sounded good enough. The noble informed him that any other information about rumors involving him and the current situation would be delivered by Hans, asking him to take a look at it. However, there was something else that had been bothering him. Just like the Black Dragon, who, after observing the blonde up close, was sure that he wasn't human. Coincidentally, Albir had the same suspicion about Kale Henatus, asking, "You're not human, are you?" The question made the redhead furrow his brows in confusion, and he replied that of course he was human. What kind of question was that? Disbelieving, the prince laughed, saying that if he wanted him to believe that, then he was human too. "You, me, we're all humans," he said through laughter. The dragon exclaimed that that sour blonde was absolutely not human, and Kim told him to shut up. He didn't want to hear any of that. But it was the first time that creature had ever seen a race with an aura like Albir's, and the MC knew he had already seen it all: dragons, humans, members of the cat and wolf tribes, which meant the prince belonged to a race different from all of those. Playing it off, he decided to act clueless, asking what else there even was to be besides human. Everyone there were people. And the noble agreed that there was nothing special about that, but he still had more to say. There was always something more to say, as if he were an endless fountain of information. Then he confessed, "I thought I was mistaken at the banquet, but there are some strange scents around you." And that was enough to make Kim freeze. Trying to distract the guy, Kim sniffed his armpit as he asked what scent he was talking about because he had just taken a shower, which seemed to work since the blonde laughed. But he quickly turned serious, explaining that he didn't think two people like them needed to sugarcoat anything. Changing the subject, Albir asked what the MC would want as a reward. Kale Henatus was famous for being trash, kicked out of the successor position 2 years ago, and the kind of person who avoided starting family conflicts. The blonde had heard he was complete garbage who only liked to party and drink too much. But what was standing in front of him was nothing like that. The trash of the family asked what he'd have to do for His Highness in exchange. To that, he replies that he would appreciate it if he didn't mention anything to the other nobles, along with offering some praise to the crown when asked about it, including the prince's understanding personality. Kim knew the royal family was in an embarrassing position after the day's events. They only offered him a reward because the nobles were trying to weaken the power of the crown, and the Henatus were known for their neutrality. Shifting focus, Albir grows curious. "Since it's an ancient power, what you showed today isn't the limit of your powers, is it?" he asks. And the redhead confirms it, explaining that the shield was honestly kind of useless, except for what it did that morning. The prince was someone who knew more about ancient powers than others, though not as much as our boy. Now that he thought about it, the ancient power of Star of Healing was given to the first prince by his mother. But he breaks away from the thought as he's asked what he wanted, if it was something for the Henatus family, Albir's investments on the coast, or the support of the crown. Upon hearing that those things didn't belong to Kale, the blonde is surprised. Then finally he reveals that all he wanted was the reward, which gets a genuine laugh out of the noble, who admits the trash was quite straightforward. Well, he may have lived like trash, but in the end he was still human, and like anyone else, he desired wealth and power. Before his family or anyone around him, the most important thing was himself. With that, Albir proposes medals, titles, and even a faction in the capital. Kim smiles at the ideas, but quickly explains that what he really wanted was money. That catches the blonde off guard. So the redhead tries to be clear. "Please, give me money. I don't want a medal or a title. A war would break out soon, and there'd be no use for those things. Money was much better. It was smarter to grab the cash and invest it in food, land, and other material goods. Besides, the next power he wanted was the sound of the wind, which got stronger the more money was spent." To Albir, the protagonist just wanted money so he could drown himself in booze. Hearing that, Kim laughs, asking how he guessed, which leaves the man a little shocked. There was no way he was serious. But if that's what he wanted, once he received the report the next day, he should take a look and let him know how much he'd want. Pouting, the young master asks if he was going to visit him again, and the man asks if he didn't want his visit. It sucked having to act like a nice guy because all he does is smile and say it would be an honor, despite not thinking that at all. Even though he found the reaction a bit exaggerated, Albir decides not to comment and turns away, asking the guest to rest as he bids farewell. Alone in the room, the dragon asks his human if there was a power capable of changing someone's color without mana. Noticing his silence, the creature insists. But Kim was determined to ignore him. He was a patient from then on. Later, Hans enters the room to deliver a letter that Ron had left before leaving. In it, the old man promises to deliver a report every month, and he comments that he had no idea the boy was hiding such a powerful ability. He also mentions that Choi Han had informed him what that person looked like, assuring that he'd remember and that he informed Beacrox as well. Now that his face was known by the former assassin and his son, Redico would probably be destroyed if seen by the butler. After a few hours, Eric enters the boy's room worried because he heard he'd been seriously injured. Gilbert and Amarillo were with him, and Kim says he had no strength left in his body, and his stomach hurt too. But of course, they didn't need to know that it was because he had spent the entire day eating. There wasn't any more room in his belly. The group asks him to let them know if he needs anything, because they could get him whatever he wanted. That makes the redhead smile in satisfaction. But that friendly mood ends when he states he knew they weren't there just to check on him, which was true. Handing over an envelope, Eric explains that it was the updated request for investment in tourism along the northeastern coast. The nerd had brought it with him since he was on his way to see the young master, who now stared at the contents of the envelope seriously. It looked like they had all decided to proceed with the development of the naval base. Eric informs him that that news would soon reach Count Henatus's ears, as with the proposal now in the noble's hands. Putting the pieces together, the MC confirms that the group intended to meet with the first prince to discuss the situation, which was indeed the case. They could only start moving if he showed some interest, so they scheduled a meeting for that same day. The redhead assured them that everything would be fine, authorizing them to send documents like that through a servant instead of coming to see him personally, which wasn't easy. But the group protested, insisting they would continue coming in person. Then Eric said goodbye to his friend, wishing him a good rest. Along with his team of mages and swordsmen, Kim noticed a trace of unease on Choi's face, so he told him to go already, leaving him confused. And Rosalind protested, apologizing as she explained that she needed both the hero and Locke. Now that she had revealed herself at the palace, she had to go home as soon as possible, because the people who had tried to get rid of her would start covering their tracks. However, she knew she wouldn't make it back in one piece alone. The incident had revealed that she was a high-ranking mage, so her enemies would gather more forces to attack her. That's why she needed strong allies. Kim said she didn't need to apologize, since she had helped them in a very difficult situation. It was more than fair for them to help her too. After all, she was like an older sister to Locke and a great friend to Choi Han. She thanked him for the kind words. However, the hero complained, saying he should be protecting the young master, but was cut off by the redhead. He needed to leave so he could have some peace and prepare to hide during the war, so he said nothing was going to happen. He planned to save up as much money as possible and get strong enough to escape from there. Then he could finally live the peaceful life he was aiming for, and he was planning on living a very long life. Besides, with a dragon protecting him, Choi Han was just dead weight. Hearing his words, the swordsman understood and said he was just overly worried. Now that he'd gotten rid of the boy, he had one more matter to address. He called Locke, who was hiding behind the wall. The boy walked up to him, looking nervous just being in the same room. Kim explained that he was going to look for his younger siblings and asked him to go with Rosalind and only return to his territory in 3 months. Though unsure, he agreed, which made the MC question what he meant by yes, and if he had already forgotten their agreement. He had to return to Henatus territory at the right time if he wanted to find his siblings safe and sound. He handed a map to the boy from the Blue Wolf tribe, who looked grateful to have a place to return to. And Kin reassured him, repeating that it was a place to return to, and that he shouldn't forget to come back only when the time was right. With his eyes shining, the boy said he would do as he was told. The story might have changed a lot, but the main points remained the same, and that's how it needed to be for Kim to use the information he had. It was a shame he hadn't been able to send Ron and Beacrox too, but he was sure he'd manage that when the butler returned from vacation. A third person suddenly entered the room. It was Hans, asking permission from the young master, who asked what the problem was this time. And he revealed that a rumor was going around that the king wanted to award him a medal. The protagonist took the scroll the butler had brought, curious. On the paper, it read, "To Kale Henatus, the noble who showed the pride of the Henatus family that protects the kingdom from the forest of darkness." Kim turned purple from disgust. It's not like he hadn't expected something like that from the royal family, but that didn't make it any less irritating.